Warning, this content is for entertainment and educational purposes only. All right, folks, Big Paul here today, and I've got a good one for you. This is a talk interview that I did with Paul Carter and Kurt Havens. Paul reached out to me a few weeks back and was talking about my progress over the last 3 years, where I put on a bunch of stage weights and how my training, I don't train to failure. I don't do sort of the traditional stuff that most guys do. And it begged the question, which is more important or matters the most when it comes on to putting maximal amount of size as a training? Is it PEDs? And this got a discussion started, and I told Paul I thought it would be good to bring Kurt Havens in on this one, and we can go into some great detail about training versus PEDs and how they both fit together and how they both do unique things when it comes to growing and what they both contribute to putting on maximum amount of size. I know it's a bunch of word spaghetti there, word salad that I put together. But anyway, it is a really awesome talk. Two really smart guys that I both admire talking about what it takes to get huge when it comes to PEDs and training. I think you're going to love this one, and we'll get started in just 1 second. What's going on, dudes?
Nothing, man. Happy to be here with you guys today. We missed a whole bunch of really gold, grade A stuff in the preliminary.
We'll see if we can rehash it.
I'm just glad to be part of this. This is like a groundbreaking thing, I think, the three of us.
Yeah, so what we wanted to talk about today, guys, is sort of the science or just some ideas, thoughts behind what makes you grow as far as training and PEDs go. Paul and I got into a conversation a couple weeks ago, and Paul reached out to me about my growth over the last couple of years, where I went from basically 3 years from 185 up to 250 on stage, and was asking about my PEDs, and we kind of got into the discussion about maybe training doesn't matter so much when your PEDs are pushed high. But, it's not to say the training isn't important. It's, you can still do fantastic things and even better. And I'm sure there's probably things I could have done even better with training if I'd been more intelligent about it. But anyway, I thought it would be good to get the two of the smartest minds together and we can talk through some of this stuff.
Yeah, like I said, I think we going back to that conversation, you had posted up that before and after pick from 47 to 50, and your progress is just phenomenal. And you had commented on a post I had made, and you reiterated, you're like, look, man, I have over the past, 3 years, I've slept 6 hours a night, 5 or 6 hours a night.
Yeah.
I haven't progressively overloaded anything, and I put on all of that extra tissue.
And I basically eat 1 gram of protein per pound.
That was what it was too. Is like I'm eating. That was another thing. We didn't even get into that. The protein. There's really a lot of bro science stuff, Kurt. I'm glad to have you on here with me today to talk about that kind of stuff, because I feel like I've taken a necessary amount of heat over some of these topics, because I'm giving people what I know is real good information, but it goes against a lot of the long standing bro mythologies that people have regurgitated, and it doesn't really get checked. And then when you give people something in the way of like, okay, this is what physiology shows, or this is what endocrinology shows, they just have like these emotional triggering meltdowns where that can't be it, because they've had this long-standing belief that it doesn't work that way, or it works this other way.
Or Jay Cutler does it that way, or
because they're like, well, so it will work for Jay. I'm like, I don't care. I don't know how many times I have to tell people that. I'm like, I don't care what worked for Ollie or Jay, or I don't care what worked for Arnold. It's completely irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant. And we'll get into that. We were talking a little bit about that in the preliminary part, that once steroids were really pushed into the bodybuilding scene, it allowed guys to do some really goofy stuff with their training and still get like ridiculous results. And we'll get into that during this. But taking somebody who's a hyper responder to androgens and trying to use their training approach as something that has validity to it. Now, you could be a guy who's taking androgens and has a very smart and intelligent training approach. Mm-hmm. But you can't look at a guy that just because he's super jacked and go, well, this guy knows how to train. If he's taking 3 grams of stuff a week and he's a hyper responder, like this, you just have to take him out and say, okay, look, this guy is getting a stimulus that has nothing to do with his training that causes him to look like that. And you can't look at his training and go, that's how I need to train.
Yeah. And to sum it up for people that wonder what makes someone a hyper responder, it seems to be presence, like density of the classic androgen receptor. The more receptors you have, the more you're going to respond to drugs, right? The poor responders can take a ton of drugs and get nothing out of it. I work with all levels of guys that can grow on 500 milligrams, and I work with guys that could probably take 3 grams and get very little out of it. Right?
You and I have both seen the responders and non-responders, Kurt. I feel bad for the guys that take gear and can't get anything out of it.
Your first cycle should kind of dictate where you go, right? If you take 300 milligrams a test your first time and you're not making a pretty dramatic change, it's probably not the game to get involved in, because you're probably.
Yeah, I remember that's a really interesting point. I've used that with people, and I think you can apply that to both, whether you are genetically gifted in terms of growing muscle naturally. I've told guys this, man, dudes just have meltdowns over the truth. And I've said, you'll know quickly in your first 6 months of training if you are a genetic outlier, because you'll be one of the most jacked dudes in the gym very quickly. Very quickly.
Look at Gabe. I coach a pro named Gabe, and he posted his, remember when he posted his before and after photos? Yeah. He was the biggest guy. He's only been lifting for 3 years. He's headed to the Olympia probably next year. He was the biggest dude in the gym in the first month of ever training without drugs.
Yeah.
Just respond.
I do not think that people understand there's definitely a magnitude. Most people fall somewhere on the spectrum, in the middle range of the spectrum as far as growing muscle. But then there's guys that are far on each side of things. Some guy that just not going to grow very much at all. And there's a guy that's going to be on the other end of the spectrum that's going to grow very quickly and really almost max out his genetic potential in a very short time span. It doesn't mean they keep growing. It just means that guy that both has high degrees of voluntary activation, he can activate his fibers very easily, and he has a lot of type 2 fibers that he can activate. He's going to grow really fast.
Here's Gabe, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's insane.
And that's in.
You would never think from that guy's before picture he's going to look like that.
And that's in 3 years.
No, he's going to be an Olympia competitor. I mean, he's a big dude.
Yeah, he's absolutely jacked. But I tell guys that they'll be like, well, how do I know? I've been training for 5 years, really. I'm like, dude, if you've been training 5 years and you've been training hard for 5 years and you don't have a lot of muscle, it's not going to happen. Not naturally. That same guy could get on and be a hyper responder, but just not be a guy that's got really great levels of voluntary activation or doesn't have a lot of type 2 fibers, but suddenly gets on and blows up and huge. I've seen that from guys that were natural and trained and built like a little bit of muscle and they would get on. I was definitely not a hyper responder, but I actually grew pretty well easily from the time I started lifting. So when I was 14, I was 97, 96 pounds. And then by the time I was 18, I was 220. So I grew naturally pretty well, but I was definitely not a hyper responder. When I got on, it's like you said, Kurt, you're going to know from that first cycle. And I did 500 milligrams of test and I got some out of it, but I was so geeked because I was like, I'm about to be so jacked. And then I'm looking 3-4 months down the road. I'm like, I gained some,
but that's you might be an interesting case. I was thinking about this before the video. So I coach a guy that's in the NFL, and he's been natural most of his life. Since very recently, he's been on steroids. He's clearly a very large, strong individual if you're playing in the NFL. Yeah. He gained very little size on steroids because he was already near his maximal capacity, genetics-wise, natural, that the drugs really just seemed to improve his strength, maybe some neurological stuff, perhaps. It's hard to say, but he didn't really get much bigger. And you could have been like that. You might have already been close to.
By the time that I got on, I had done a bulk up to 256 pounds naturally. And
yeah, that's pretty big.
That's a big dude. Yeah.
I can send you a picture. I still had an outline of abs at 256 naturally. When I cut down naturally, I was still like 208, 210, and I'm 5'11". For a natural guy, that's pretty big. And I was in single digits. So when I did like my last show, I was like 230 plus on stage. So you got to figure that was around 20, probably put on 20 something pounds, 20 or 30 pounds. So my biggest when I was on, I was around 290, but I was pretty chunky at that weight.
There's not many guys that are lean at 290.
No.
It's Ronnie Coleman at that point.
No, unless you're like a Ronnie Coleman. I mean, we got to get into
that's rare.
Big time outliers. And I think there's the rumor that Ronnie, I don't know if you ever heard this one, Kurt, that Ronnie was running up to 20 something IU a day of growth at his prime.
I believe I've used 18, so that's fine.
Okay.
So that's pretty normal. Most of the, again, people lose their freaking minds when I talk about real cycles of some of the big pros, because you get a mix. There's a handful of guys that are honest, 5, 6. There are a ton of guys that when they do consults with me, they'll be honest with me on the phone, and then they say something different on the internet, which whatever, that's it. I think it's misleading. And then there are other guys that just blatantly make up stuff. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't pros that use smaller doses. Again, being a genetic responder, a good responder, means that you both respond to low doses and high doses, right? You can grow on a low dose, but you can also tolerate a high dose. Right? If you're a poor responder, you would not get anything from a low dose, but if you raise it, you're only going to get there's an androgen receptor on the cell surface that's just non-genomic, and a lot of side effects come from that.
Right.
You just get banged with that organ stuff, stress, no sleep, nervous system, hypothalamus. You're going to sweat. So the good responders can do both. So it's not to say that there aren't pros that use that, but most of the big guys on the Olympia stage are they're using at least 5 grams of gear. At least I know some that use 10, and they're generally using a bottle of Serostim a day. So that's 18 units. I have 2 guys personally that have used up to 10 grams of gear. I usually lower that because you don't need that much. If you can handle 10 grams of gear, you're probably going to be fine on 5. Just so much systemic stress. It doesn't mean but people lose their minds when I say that, because I've never used more than 3 units of growth hormone, and you weigh 300 pounds on stage.
No, that's not.
No way. I'm sorry. It's not happening.
No.
I sent Paul a picture of I didn't do my first cycle till I was 39. I trained natural. I didn't believe in doing that shit. I tried to take my body as far as I could naturally.
I did too.
At 39, my body started not working too well.
And one of the things I even tell guys is this: if you are training intelligently, which means hard, you're not doing the high volume stuff, using good motions, progressively overloading, I think you're going to max out your natural potential in 8 to 10 years. That's as far as you're going to be able to take it.
Well, and you'll appreciate this from the majority. So I started lifting when I was 13. I took a break in my 30s, but I've been lifting for 37 years. The majority of my lifting career, I lifted 3, maybe 4 days a week.
Yep.
Every other day. I did upper lower for most of it, and I did cardio on the off days. And guys are doing the silly bro splits, and they're really not making progress. Like I said, I gained almost 90 pounds of muscle.
And I do the exact opposite. I'm in the gym every day.
You can do it and you tolerate it, and you're growing from it. So, but again, we're going to get into why that even works, right?
Well, let's
natural, that's not going to work.
Let's talk about the one of the things that I say that, and I talked about this on the Table Talk podcast. Man, I took so much heat from this. Is the idea that androgens, testosterone cycles, whatever you're taking, is giving you this exponential amount of recovery ability, which is why once you get on, you need to do more volume. That's a completely different subject by itself. But you need to do more volume, you need to train more often, do all this kind of stuff. So I want to talk about 2 studies. I don't remember the name of them. I said we would talk a ton about research, but we have 2 really well done studies. Kirk, I think you know the ones I'm going to talk about here. The one where they gave them 600 mega tests a week.
Basin, both of them.
Yep. And then in one, they had 4 groups. They had a control group. They had a group that sat at home and did nothing and took steroids. They had a group that did not take steroids but went to the gym. And then they had a group that took steroids and went to the gym. Now, the interesting thing about the outcomes of that study is that if you take the gains the guys got at home, and the average guy gains almost 8 pounds of muscle sitting at home,
on 600 milligrams,
doing nothing. So if you take the gains that the guys got sitting at home, and you just literally combine it with the gains the natural guys got, it's almost exactly the same figure as the group that took steroids and went to the gym. And I'm like,
That's
guys,
interesting.
that's not telling you a little bit about what I'm saying. I don't know what to tell you at this point, because what they're showing is you have one stimulus that's coming from the gym, mechanical tension, that's stimulating muscle growth, like you said, biomechanical transduction, and the body says, let me add more myofibrils, as the adaptation to strength training. That we know that. It tells us also because the people sitting at home don't have mechanical tension going on, and they grew. So it's a completely different stimulus. And when you look at that stimulus and you take the stimulus from the gym and you combine them, like I said, and you look at the other group that got to take 600 mega tests a week and then go to the gym, it's almost identical. And I've said this for quite some time. I was like, the training that a natural guy does is going to maximize results. If he ever decides to get on, doesn't need to change a thing. He just lets the androgens do their job, figure out the androgen cycle that works for you to maximize those results, but keep training in a smart, intelligent way. There's no such thing, in my opinion. Now, if research comes out, we talked about this early on, I said, anytime research comes out that contradicts something that I have a belief in, I will change my belief if it's good research. I have no problem with that. I don't think that there is some massive degree of recovery that's happening once you get on. And I think a lot of that has probably been extrapolated out from the research on Anavar and burn victims and stuff like that. And they're looking at burn victims, but that's a completely different type.
Yeah.
We're not looking at contusions. We're not looking at basically any type of apoptosis. We're not looking at cellular death from the same standpoint. When we have damage that occurs from workout, it always occurs from a intracellular calcium overload inside the cell that causes an activation of calpains. And then they do a type of cellular death where there's destruction to the existing myofibrils. And then afterwards, those have to be repaired. I haven't seen any research that shows there's a reduction or there's an accelerated rate from being on steroids and how it reduces the amount of time it takes to recover from that. The argument that was brought up to me was that there's studies that show muscle protein synthesis is elevated for extended periods. I'm like, I don't care. Muscle protein synthesis is kind of a nothing burger. You can get an increase in muscle protein synthesis or mTOR or any of that kind of stuff.
Hamburger.
Yeah, from ingesting a bunch of leucine.
Is any tissue grown?
Myofibril protein synthesis is only kicked off through training. And that's the only one.
Or the other pathways that we can.
Yeah. So you can have muscle protein synthesis elevated. And the other thing is if you get into the research, it kind of elevates for around 24 hours and then starts to come down. Myofibril protein synthesis is a completely different cellular process and has a completely different timeline. So they're not even completely related. So what we're interested in from a training standpoint is what is going on with myofibril protein synthesis, because that's what's going to add new contractile proteins. That's what's going to give us muscle growth, going to make us stronger, et cetera, so forth and so on. So I haven't seen anything, and if somebody has the research and send it to me, and look at that. If
I can show you, I should have said it before. I can show you with catabolic states where then stimulating the AR will stop the calpains and all that stuff and the calcium ion buildup. So we kind of work backwards with that stuff, basically in wasting, not so much in a lifting state problem.
The problem, Kurt, that we run into with that is isolating something off, right? Which is why another reason why anytime you combine compounds, you could never run a study combining compounds because it's
too many variables.
There's too many variables. So you'd have to start with one compound. So we're just using test. We already know that test itself is going to create new tissue via a completely different mechanism. So it becomes tough to isolate that off to say, here's the mechanisms that's creating a faster recovery time that occurred from the activation of calpains. And here's what's actually going on with the new tissue accrual via a completely different stimulus that's occurring via testosterone. So it's really a couple of different topics that we're looking at. This happens a lot in terms of when we're dealing with multiple mechanisms, and why for the long time, like muscle damage and then metabolic stress, we're able to kind of permeate the landscape of still having potential properties for growing muscle, because it can be difficult to isolate those off from mechanical tension and then see, okay, is any of these actually, are they stimulating anabolic signaling? And then does that anabolic signaling, because you can't always use anabolic signaling anyway, like I said, because mTOR can get turned on for a multitude of reasons, not stimulate growth. Muscle protein synthesis is kind of a nothing burger. So we have a multitude of pathways. People attach themselves to pathways. And I'm like, you have to get back to myops, and if myops is creating new contractile proteins, that's it at the end of the day. So if we have to be able to somehow isolate those things off, and that becomes difficult sometimes in these mechanisms, because you have to say, okay, is this actually doing this thing? So if you're on anabolics, is it actually creating a faster recovery time, or is it just creating new tissue? And that's what you're seeing. Because for example, you can't do a test where, like, one of the ways that we use in testing to see if people are recovering or if muscle damage is still present is strength testing. So if you're not back to baseline, myofibrils are still in repair, recovery, damage mode. And then you're like, okay, so strength testing is not back to baseline, so we're not recovered. That's another problem with the frequency we didn't even get into. It's like, I'm like, man, well, they're not even recovered. They did 10 sets today and they tested them 4 days later, and they're still not even back to baseline. So that's a completely different topic. But some of these are tough to isolate off, because you couldn't use a strength testing study to determine if steroids were giving you fast recovery using strength testing, because the guys that sat at home were able to go to the gym and almost match the natural guys that had been doing those movements for the whole 10 weeks. So it was real contractile protein. Some people tried to make so steroid guys tried to make the argument at first that it wasn't real muscle, that it was fluid or whatever. I'm like, dude, what are you talking about?
They did biopsies.
I'm like, they actually looked at the cross-sectional area. They looked at the cross-sectional area and they strength tested them. It's real muscle, dude. It's not fake muscle. The other theory is that there's hyperplasia going on with.
Probably not at that dose.
You don't think so?
We can get into that in a second. So I'm just going to explain so people understand. So we're talking from a weightlifting point of view, like we said in the before we were recording. We're talking about mechanotransduction, right? That's pretty much the platform that you stand on. This is what you get stuck talking about all day long. The training. So that's from training. That's a muscle growth from training. It's the only mechanism of growth from training. I hate to hit the pump, doesn't cause it, right? Metabolic stress doesn't cause this. From steroids specifically, whether you're talking testosterone or you're talking other drugs, there's 3 other main ways that you're going to grow: through IGF, which will splice into mechanical growth factor inside the muscle. The serum IGF doesn't matter. Downstream PI3K. Mm-hmm. And the androgen receptor. So you have those 3 mechanisms. So when you're sitting at home, the testosterone itself was probably dealing with all 3 of those, even if there's no mechanotransduction occurring, right? And that'll still bypass that whole thing. When you talk about pathways, the other problem with pathways, you have to follow the whole thing. Just because you've activated a pathway doesn't mean downstream, right? Cancer works through mTOR, but it's forks at the C fork, so that cancer is a totally different branch just because mTOR is active.
You remember when that's an interesting point to bring up. Remember when it used to be that there was the idea, that's a really great point, Kurt, because the idea was they would work their way backwards on the downstream, and then they would get to you see, I already know you're talking about. I'm like, dude, you can't do it like that. They would start and they go, mTOR is bad, cellular reproduction. How far down did you go down the downstream, bro? Like, how
they didn't go anywhere on it because they don't understand it. They looked at the chart of the cell and they stopped at mTOR because the rest of it was a bunch of letters that they didn't know what they meant.
They didn't know what they were talking about. So I'm like, okay.
And then from there, like I said before we recorded, then there's 88 genes that we know of. There's 300-ish genes, you might know the answer, that affect muscle, it seems like, give or take, in the human body.
Yeah.
There's 88 that steroids affect directly, at least that we're aware of. It doesn't mean they don't affect all 300, but only the 88 ones have been studied. And then the basic ones are Notch, WNT, and NUM. And then that gene set then causes all sorts of other expression with the androgen receptor. So when you do drugs, you're getting a whole cascade of responses that you're just not going to get from picking up a heavy weight and going to failure.
Yeah, it's the fact that study exists is it gave us so much. There's the other one I think it was run by the same guy where it had the guy sit at home for 20 weeks. Do you remember that one? They sat at home for 20 weeks and did super normal doses of tests, and they grew an average of like 20 pounds.
That was the dose response in healthy men. Well, so the great thing about Bazin, the guy who did those studies, is in my industry, we actually broke down endocrinology into the pre-Bazin era and the post-Bazin era. He was so groundbreaking that before he did those studies, most physicians didn't think testosterone or anabolic steroids did anything for muscle growth.
That's
There were
wild.
doctors in the early 90s that would tell you that steroids didn't work.
Yeah, I remember
never
that.
saw Arnold Schwarzenegger or watched Pumping Iron or went to a gym because they thought that this stuff, the only theory that they might have believed is that somehow it stopped muscle protein breakdown. So maybe then there was a net accrual somehow.
The net accrual from, we get back to muscle protein synthesis because they didn't understand the multiple cellular processes that were going on. So it was the idea. Remember when this used to go on? It was the idea that muscle protein breakdown was the boogeyman, and we had to really reduce muscle protein breakdown through insulin spikes post workout and all this kind of stuff. I'm like, dude, you bring it down relatively easy. It does. You don't have to do a whole lot to bring it down. It's not really doing a whole lot.
Well, so, and with pathways too, an interesting thing is I feel like I've heard you speak to this as well. The other problem with activating a pathway too is when you go down it, like we talk about mTOR, you could activate mTOR and not build muscle because during the translation stage there's an energy requirement, right? So if you're in a deficit, and even if you stimulate mTOR with mechanotransduction and eating leucine, if there's no energy sensed at the translation stage, and it doesn't have to be that great, guys also overeat, thinking that the food is like force growth.
The mTOR one still drives me crazy because I'm like, mTOR can get turned on for a multitude of reasons. It doesn't mean muscle is going to be built. The other one we talked about a little bit before, we see an increase. People have tried to say that the eccentric or the stretch part is more quote unquote anabolic because we see greater degrees of mTOR. I'm like, right, because the stretch activated ion channels get opened up and dump a bunch of calcium ions into the cell. So mTOR goes, well, I'm going to have to increase my ops because I have to do a lot more damage repair now. Nobody gets, if somebody's trying to manipulate, there's this one a-hole PhD on social media. Either he does not understand this to the degree he tries to make himself out to be, or he's just being disingenuous on purpose. But he'll say like the stretch is more anabolic. It's the more anabolic portion of the movement. And I'm like, you're saying that because of a higher degree of mTOR expression, which means nothing. In the grand scheme of things, it means nothing. mTOR it's like satellite cell proliferation. I'm like, what are we looking at when we see satellite cell proliferation? It's almost always a repair and regeneration process it's associated with. We don't need satellite cell proliferation in order to add myofibrils. Mm-hmm. So anytime these things get lost in the mix, I understand they're complicated and complex topics, but the problem is there's too many people talking about this shit that don't have any idea as to the complexities of how this ultimately ends up either working for somebody or not doing anything at all.
Yeah. And so with that, because you brought up hyperplasia before. So again, we only have data showing single drug use, right? Because we don't study multiple things going on. So like a lot of that data comes from HIV, and we do see increased cell mass. So one of the issues with HIV versus with the three of us is if you were inactive, right, you'll lose some muscle size, but you're not losing the actual cell mass. With HIV, you actually lose the cell mass.
Yeah,
so the cells actually disappear.
It's almost like a type of like a mini necrosis. Yeah.
And basically, we play with 1 million doses of different things, and it seems that the only thing that really causes permanent new cells to come in hyperplasia is growth hormone, and it has to be at 6 milligrams. Basically, there seems to be a point of diminishing returns, which is 18 units. Okay. Now, again, that's without steroids. It doesn't mean that you couldn't get less. You couldn't get the same response with less. We just don't know. But like Anadrol, these things will cause new cell mass, but then after a washout period, it's gone. That's what you see, right? You run a test cycle, you will enlarge your muscles, but you're not necessarily getting the new cell mass you're not growing new cells at that point.
Yeah. So when we're talking about the testosterone studies, what do you feel like if you're looking at, okay, you bring in the test, the guy sitting at home is doing nothing. What is the mechanistic chain of events that are going on that are creating? So you don't think that there's any hyperplasia really going on there at all?
I'd be hesitant to say there is. I would think it's more androgen receptor and then catechin stimulating more androgen receptor. And then there's more androgen receptors built up during the translation. It's just a constant stimulation of the androgen receptor is just causing more protein accrual, but not necessarily new cells created. There are probably new nuclei, but that's not what you're referring to. You're referring to as a full new cell. I don't believe so.
Yeah. So
I could be wrong. I don't know. I don't believe.
I think there's some research. Again, I didn't come just fully prepared, and I was glad because Paul's like, no, we're just going to BS it, man. I'm like, okay. So I think there's some research that shows in anabolic. Now, this is one of those correlation isn't causation things, but I think there's some research that shows AAS guys, they postulate that they have hyperplasia because of the the number of fibers relative to, say, looking at untrained people.
Okay.
Now, there's a multitude of problems with those studies. It also could be that the guy that has more fibers, he didn't get hyperplasia. It could be that he grew easier, so he was more inclined to stay with training rather than the untrained guy, or the guy that it didn't grow as much and didn't stick with training. I'd have to go back and revisit these studies, but I remember thinking that you couldn't necessarily draw a complete conclusion by looking at the number of fibers that a guy has in a division of a muscle and say, okay, well, he clearly has hyperplasia, because maybe the reason why he stuck with training is because he does have more. If he does have more type 2 fibers, he can grow easier than the guy that has less. So therefore, he's more inclined to stick with training. I mean, that's kind of a thing too. But I think they postulated that it was possible that there's some hyperplasia occurring.
I mean, it could. It's through IGF, right? And certain steroids, testosterone and trenbolone specifically, increase intermuscular IGF more than other drugs. Like nandrolone, for instance, doesn't have any effect. Like unless you're injured and you're a rat, it doesn't seem to increase IGF inside the muscle. So they all work a little different. But it's possible that if the dose were high enough, right, for that individual, again, depending on AR content and things, because dose means very little, right? The standardized dose doesn't mean anything because we all might respond differently to the same dose. It's possible. It's also, did they test the fiber amount before on those people? Did they test, like, it was on their traps, I think, right?
Yeah, I want to say what they did. If I remember, I'm drawing from memory, so don't quote me. Don't hold me accountable. I want to say it was they were looking at guys who had taken steroids versus guys who
I wonder if they also had more fibers to begin with, or in their.
That was my initial thought. Was like, so how do we know they just didn't have more fibers than the natural guy to begin with? Like,
because then they're going to be a better responder. Right?
Exactly. That was my thought too. It's like you can't. I think they did make note of the fact that it wasn't like you couldn't take this as full on, correlation by causation, but it was just a case for me that it wasn't a slam dunk. The idea that hyperplasia is going on is interesting because I want to say, because Stu Phelps, who's another guy, is fantastic, does some amazing work, said there is some research, he didn't quote what it was, that was pretty good at identifying that anabolics did cause some hyperplasia. I think my own theory looking at this is I think there's probably a little bit combination potentially of both, where there may be some hyperplasia going on, but I also think there's probably something going on with just the addition of myofibrils inside the existing cells through the androgen receptor sites. So there's got to be some type of downstream. It's like once the steroids get to the androgen receptors, there's got to be something that has nothing to do with mechanotransduction that is creating more myofibrils within the existing cells.
So that's protein. Yeah, I mean, that's protein synthesis, and then it will continue to carry. Like I said, there's other things that then will further magnify the androgen receptor at that point.
Yeah.
Right? Androgen receptors are then upregulated through translation as well. When new DNA is created, then there's a new androgen receptor. So the longer you do drugs, the more drugs you do, the more androgen receptors you create. So that it's going to continually be a magnified effect, right? And you see that the first time you run a cycle, if you were to run a gram a test your first cycle, most likely you're going to not feel very well, right? But like down the road, you can tolerate these big doses, right?
Yep.
Because you have more places for the drugs to go.
My first cycle was 500 milligrams a test, and I didn't want to do anything crazy. And I thought 500 milligrams for a first cycle was a good,
more than enough. Yeah.
Was probably, and I felt fine on it. But like I said, I didn't get a magnitude of, and I do think that you're right about that. And some of this stuff, because I've been off for like 10 years and I don't really think about any drug stuff anymore. And I only have recently, again, where I was like, maybe I'll do one last cycle. But one of the things I kind of thought at the time was like, maybe the outcomes that you're going to get on, I consider like moderate cycles, if you've maxed out your native potential, is unless you are like a hyper responder. Let's just say you're a normal responder, but you spent 10 years, you've really maxed out your natural potential, then I think what you're going to get even off of a good cycle is going to be underwhelming compared to what a guy who's like smaller, hasn't spent many years eating well. Dude, I don't think people get this, man. When I was growing up in the 90s, we just had magazines, books.
Me too. Yep.
We had to force feeding, training hard. I was lucky that I gravitated really early on towards Dorian Yates and that style of training. And I think that saved me a lot of years of doing stupid shit. And I figured out very early on, progressive overload was how I was going to get bigger. It's like, well, if these dudes are lifting X amount of load And I can take my measly 60-pound dumbbell incline press to 100 pounds for 8 reps.
You get bigger.
I'm gonna get bigger. I figured that out at like 15 years old. And that clearly is what works. And I still have guys like don't even understand like the basics of progressive overload. I'm like, well, you got to be able to do more reps with that weight next week. And then you kind of cap it off somewhere, and then you add load. So it's like double progression, right? So I just went I worked in the 8 to 12 rep range at the time. And I would set a goal. It's like, if I can do this for 8 reps, when I can do it for 12, I'll bump the load to something that brings me back to 8. And I did that for, I don't know how long. And then the other part was learning when I was really skinny. And I don't know how much you need to do this now, but I can't argue with what happened, was learning how to eat massive amounts of food.
Yeah, we all have to learn that. It's what, you know what, with all that stuff, because maybe we can talk about that for a second. I find that our generation, we had to figure all this stuff out on our own.
Yes, we did.
No resources. And I think that's part of the reason why our generation seems to be better at this stuff. The younger kids that have all this stuff on the internet seem to be really lost.
No critical thinking skills. None. They're devoid of critical thinking skills. They won't read a caption. The biggest reason why people think that I'm an a-hole on social media is I have to say, you already know this I'm like, did you read my caption? Dude, it takes 90 seconds to read a caption. Do they know when I sit down, this is why I have no sympathy for any of them getting butthurt. I still read 8 to 10 hours a day. You won't read a 60-second caption where I basically take 6 or 8 hours of reading and find it to this for you, and you won't read that.
And then you question it, like you're wrong.
Yeah. And then I can almost always know the questions that are going to come. And I'm like, it's point.
But what about
remembering the caption, like 0.6. Did you read the caption? 0.6. Or I'll say, tell me you didn't read my caption without telling me. And then that's me being the a-hole. I'm like, I'm giving you free information and I'm the a-hole. Okay. They're like, well, it's how you respond to people. I'm like, oh. They have these baby meltdowns.
That's why I stopped writing captions and make reels. Because people will watch reels. They won't, read shit.
You only posted memes during COVID. That's when I started following you.
That was
when you got blocked like every week. You have like 8 different accounts because you were getting.
Do you know how much people lie on me on? Do you know how many people said that I lost my account for being an a-hole? I lost my account for posting memes. I lost my account over again for posting memes because you remember that was during COVID, and if you said anything. And I would post these memes, and I'd wake up and it'd be like, your account has been suspended. I'm like, shit. But people, when I get it back, they would be like, go back to posting memes. Well, everybody was sitting at home during that time and couldn't do anything. And I would find memes throughout the day, and I would post 50 memes in my story at night.
You were like my only bit of sanity, I think, during COVID.
I heard that from so many people. They were like, you saved me during COVID, because every night I would look forward to reading your memes.
Yeah, I looked at them too. That's how I found you.
Yeah, and I would post up 50 memes. I was finding the funniest memes I could throughout the day. I had at least 50 sites that I could go to, and I would find the funniest ones. And I got so much love back from people. Like, you just kept me sane during that time, because I would literally go through your memes at night. But I lost my account multiple times over memes. I never lost my account because anything I ever said to anybody, but I lost my account over memes. I had one. You remember this one? It was where somebody takes the nail clipper and they chip off their tooth and they bite the ice cream. I lost my account for that meme for inciting violence.
Come on.
Swear to God. I lost my account for inciting violence for that meme.
You get people report you all the time.
Dude, anytime I would post anything like that was even remotely challenging to COVID, I would get mass reported and took down.
I'm on YouTube probation right now for calling somebody stupid in the comment section. They said it was hate speech.
I don't know. None of these kids would have survived 5 seconds in a modern warfare lobby from 10 years ago. I can tell you that. You had to be buckled up. Every type of awful thing you could say to a person was said to people in those lobbies, but it was expected, right? Like, it was trash talk at the highest level. And nobody really ever got offended, but it's wild to me the amount of hate that I get simply because I don't coddle people. And people are like, well, you could be nicer. I'm like, I'm literally giving you free content. I study, 8-10 hours a day to give you guys stuff that's going to make your training more effective, and I don't charge you for it. But you're mad because I say read a caption, or they'll be like, well, you said this person was a clown. I'm like, well, were they acting like a clown? Because if they were acting like a clown, you're acting like a
If it
clown.
looks like it, yeah.
You know what, Paul, you brought up a long time ago? I've reposted a bunch of these from you. Is I thought it was just me with the private profile thing. 9
Yeah.
of the time,
It's always the people
somebody's
liking your
talking
private
smack, I'll be like, I'll bet money this is a private profile with no picture. And I'll go over and look. And Paul started posting that over and over again. I'm like, okay, so I'm not going crazy.
No, it's always those people.
It's always that guy.
It's always a private profile. It's never ever like a public profile. But you know what? Probably every 6 months I'll get an influx of people who are like, hey, dude, like you blocked me like 6 months ago and I was clearly like trolling and I'm sorry. And people, I think I've blocked over 5,000 people. People will think that I'm out just like mass blocking for no reason. I'm like, if you come to my account and you talk trash or you like the trash talk, I'm just getting rid of you because you're not adding anything.
That's what I do.
I do the same thing.
Why do they get mad about this? Here's the thing, guys. Do you know I don't go to anybody's account to talk trash to them?
But why would you?
I don't either.
Why does anyone do that?
I don't know. I don't get it. I don't go to anybody's account to trash talk them.
I only follow people that I want to watch their content.
Dude, that's the other thing I don't get. People will be like, I can't stand you, but I like your content. I'm like, do you know how many people I follow I can't stand?
None.
0. Do you not think that that's a reflection of a problem within you that you don't like me for some perceived wrong?
You don't even know. They don't even know who you are.
They don't even know me, and then you still follow me. But then you talk shit on me on other accounts. But then you're like, I love your content. I'm like,
but I hate you. I hate you.
Oh man, it was horrific when I was on contest prep. The trolls that would come out of the woodwork. It's like now that I'm back to just being normal again, I don't get all the trash talking. But when I don't know if I posted
that. I would see that. Here's the other thing, Paul. I watch from the outside, and anytime you were posting your stuff up, I would DM you. I'd like looking good, brother. Like awesome. And I'd always throw. But I would see comments coming out about you, and it's so toxic and dysfunctional. It's like, clearly you put in work, you look fantastic. You post up pictures, of like when you got started again, being very vulnerable about the state of your condition. I think that's so highly admirable. And I'm like, that's one of the reasons I followed you then. It's like you were talking very openly about androgens. You'd post your pictures. Hey, this is where I went 2 years ago. The progress you've made is phenomenal. The amount of jealousy and insecurity I see out of what is supposedly grown-ass men coming at you like on your profile, and I'd be like, dude, why would you I would never go to somebody's account to say that stuff to them, ever. Like, I don't, my brain doesn't even function that way. So
mine doesn't either. It just makes me laugh. The regular dudes, whatever, the ones that get me are the guys that are like other coaches or people that are like higher up in this community. I dealt with a couple people that should know better that were talking shit about me, and I'm like, dude, just shut the fuck up. There was one guy, I won't name any names, but one guy was just talking about how pro cards are easy to get. Just kept saying they're easy to get, but he doesn't have a pro card. He doesn't have one. He doesn't have one. And I'm just like, bro, shut the fuck up, man. Like, dude, if it's that easy, go get one.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I don't and here's the other thing I'll add to this. Some people will go, even some of my haters, my bigger haters, they will at least show me a modicum of respect and not talk about like my family or my girlfriend or my ex-wife or kids. But there's people out there that will do that too.
Oh yeah, I've seen that too.
And here's my thing. I don't care if you're my mortal enemy. I will never talk about your wife or your kids or your girl, like so off limits. I don't care. I mean, most people know me and Mike Israel are not good, but I would never talk about Mike, like his family in any kind of way. We used to be really close friends. And then there's a couple of other guys, but I would never talk. And here's, I've even given credit to Mike before. Mike knows my former wife, knows my kids. He's never said a word. Like I don't even care if people attack me. That just comes with the territory of having a social media account, saying stuff that goes against the grain of other people. But have the even smallest modicum of respect to not talk about somebody's family or talk about their parents or their kids or like their private life or whatever. You just don't. If you're going to be considered an educator in any kind of way, Like the fact that you're going to stoop to that level is so wild to me. Again, I won't even say anything about the people that I have clearly are like I'm quote unquote enemies with. I would never talk about their family. That's just so out of scope of what we're doing. If I do trash somebody, it's not even a personal. It will be about the concepts they keep pushing that are just completely wrong.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
Somebody said to me the other day, and they said, there's a multitude of people that don't like you, that are always bagging on you, that say you attack people personally. And he goes, what I actually watch is you don't ever attack them personally. You attack the information they're giving out, and then they attack you personally. And I'm like, right. I'm like, he goes, that's been really cool to watch because they always say, I'm like, yeah, dude, it's called projection. It's called projection. So I don't attack people personally. Like if somebody, like shows up and they're not in contest shape or whatever, dude, I don't have anything to say about that. My focus is physiology, biomechanics, training, making that stuff more effective for the average guy. And if they're being led astray, in my opinion, by people who have ulterior motives, I'll call that stuff out. But I'm not going to attack people like on a multitude of other fronts. I think that's a very clear sign that you cannot defeat that person's stance on these other topics.
Yep.
If you can defeat me, come do it. If you can defeat what I'm giving you information wise, all you got to do is hit follow. People say, Paul limits comments. I'm like, no. They have this really cool feature at Instagram that says, if you're not my follower, you can't comment. So I do that to limit the amount of trolling stuff. Otherwise, I see people, they just get trolled to death.
Yeah.
So, but I also think social media is more toxic now than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, it is. And I agree with you, dude. You have won an intellectual argument when it's resorted to slinging personal insults.
When once the ad hominems come out, you're like, all right, I won that one. I don't even need to continue.
Paul Barnett, do you remember there was one, I'm not going to name any names. There was one social influencer that he got really upset about my Halo testing video, and he made a YouTube about me. He's like shaking. He's like visibly, he's actually losing his mind. He's like mentally ill in the video, and he's shaking.
Kurt, you never even mentioned his name.
I never even mentioned his name. He just said something that wasn't, he was recommending Halo testing for women and children, claiming it was safe. So
I remember this.
I mean, literally, medically, it's only used for bone marrow failure when you're dying. It's not used. It's an androgen. Like
it was a very respectful video.
Wait. I vaguely remember this topic because I thought I was losing my mind. I was like, is this dude saying Halo testing is safe for women?
We made a video. Dr. Dean and I made a video explaining the chemical structure of Halo testing and why when you fluorinate,
it was very respectful, very science based.
And it was like, but we didn't mention the kid's name at all on purpose. I'm not trying to call anyone out. I just don't want kids taking Halo testing. I don't want adults taking Halo testing, to be honest with you.
Dude, that was the only drug I ever took Paul, did we talk about that in the last podcast?
No, I don't think so.
I have the funniest stories from Halo testing. So I never had roid rage from anything except Halo testing.
Me too.
And I didn't even take that much. I took 15 milligrams. That's what I think the standard is, right? I took 15 milligrams of Halo testing, and I can't remember who got it for me, but he's like, that shit will make you strong, fast,
real strong,
overnight. But there comes I'm going to tell this story. This is one of my funniest drug stories. I never had, even when I ran up tests a couple of times to 2 grams a week, because I just want to see what would happen. I didn't notice anything. I just felt horrible. I just felt so bad. I didn't have roid rage. I just felt, I was so lethargic and felt terrible overall. I was like, man, this is doing nothing. I didn't get any more gains, but I wanted to see. I'm like, well, what's up with the running the big cycle stuff? So I was getting ready for this meet, and I put the Halo testing in. I didn't run my normal. I didn't run an Anadrol or D-ball or whatever. The last 3 weeks, I was like, I'm going to run Halo testing. So I ran Halo testing. I remember the day it kicked in. I was sitting at a red light, and there was this old lady crossing the crosswalk, and I was just gripping my steering wheel because she wasn't going fast enough. And I was like, if you ain't out of the crosswalk by the time this turns green, I'm going to paint my car with you. And I was like, what is the other voice inside your head that still say someone's saying your own cycle goes, bro, what is wrong with you? Like, and it's like, she better get some needed chest action going to get across this road. And then my sane voice was like, dude, you are so messed up on this cycle right now. And I also remember like the libido from it was so insane. It was so off the charts. I was married at the time. But the thing about it was, you know how like when your like libido's off the charts when you're on certain drugs, and then like you finally have an orgasm, you get like a reprieve. There's no reprieve. You're still mad as hell. You're angry. Your libido's still. You don't have a refractory period at all. It's still like there's no release from the aggression or how you feel or whatever, and your libido is just. And I can remember this is one of those too much information. I can remember waking up in the middle of the night, waking up for my libido being too high. I'm awake because my libido is so high. Thankfully, I was married.
Which and on that stuff, you're so angry. It's amazing anyone wants to have sex with you.
It's not. It's a miserable thing. People that haven't really done, I think, enough cycles. Dave Tate and I talked about this. I think they romanticize some aspects of it, right? You know what I'm talking about, Kurt. And I'm like, I actually felt the worst when I was getting ready for a meet, and I would have the low back pumps going on, and I couldn't really get effective workouts in. And the other thing Dave brought up I thought was interesting. He's like, I think you can't do as much work when you're on cycle as when you're natural. He's like, when you come off, you can do a lot of work.
Yeah.
And he's like, when you get on cycle, you don't actually feel like you're not capable of doing a lot of sets and a lot of work. So you might get a great pump. And I think that's why some guys that get on cycle, they don't train as hard because they just get such a massive pump from
you can't move your arms, nothing works. You can't shave. Shaving.
Dude, you can just get a pump sitting around.
Yeah,
you can. And I remember that. I'm like, this is pretty.
Well, you get when you're typing, like if you're writing content, you're like,
one of the
funniest things that you ever posted in your story. Someone asked you about your thoughts on growth hormone. You're like, it's a very expensive way to get numb hands.
Exactly.
I remember when I tried that.
I never ran growth because I was doing powerlifting. People always ask me.
You don't need it for powerlifting. It's not
going
to
make you stronger. And I think some people have actually said there's kind of a reduction. Some people, John told me he felt like he saw a reduction kind of in some of his strength levels when he would get.
Well, if it's creating intercellular pressure similar to a pump, it probably is counterintuitive to growth, right, and strength because the leverage is all screwed up.
Oh, be careful! Once you start telling people that the pump actually interferes with growth,
I'm gonna get heckled.
I've posted a bunch of studies to actually like irrefutably prove that the pump at basically at worst, it's going to reduce force production by way of excitation, contraction, failure. So you don't actually get mechanical tension at the largest fires. And the best thing is just it's not doing anything at all. But there's absolutely it's not linked to. In one of the studies where they looked at myofibrillar protein synthesis related to short rest periods and long rest periods, they hypothesized in there that the cellular swelling that's occurring from the shorter rest periods is actually interfering
with growth. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, is it stopping you from recruiting the fibers? And again, I'm not quoting because some of these guys are nuts, but like Mike Mentzer knew that didn't do anything 50 years ago, right? Frank Zane said the pump is the only function the pump serves is basically to show you what you look like if you gain 10 pounds of muscle.
That's a pretty good way.
Arnold was the only one who hung on to the pump as if it
were. The pump, yeah. I'm get a pump. I feel like I'm calming when I get a pump and I pump me up back. Arnold was the guy that promoted the pump, but then you still even got guys like, the kid sensation Sam Sula goes around talking about the pump all the time and getting a pump. And I'm like, yeah, but there's no growth from the pump. I get that it feels good and you like it and you like how you look, and it's basically like makeup for dudes who lift weights, but it's not doing anything for you.
What do you guys think about this? Like the way I've looked at it, like I've always told people, like it's an indicator that you're actually working the muscle that you're trying to target. Like I look at it as a cue more than
when you get swelling in a muscle, it is feedback that you have activated the largest type 2 fiber types that you have in that muscle because they have more swelling. Here's what I would tell people as far as the pump goes. You already know when you have one muscle that grows really fast because it gets pumped easily. Mm-hmm. The pump is just feedback that you have more type 2 fibers you can recruit in that muscle. Okay. So that's what the feedback is saying. The one way, because I'll use this. Let's say you get a muscle that won't grow really well. If you found an exercise that gave you a great pump that you didn't get before, it could conceivably be used as a proxy that you are able, for whatever reason, to activate more type 2 fibers with that exercise in that muscle. So you could be using an exercise where you are more dominant in another muscle group. Let's say it's a compound exercise and you're more dominant in another muscle group and you get a really good pump in that muscle. But then the muscle group that's a weak muscle, let's say you, because the rear delts should get a good stimulus from doing row motions, right?
In theory.
Let's say you have really poor rear delts, but then you start doing some specific rear delt exercises and you do get a rear delt pump up. You're like, well, then definitely stick with those because it's probably a decent sign you're getting activation. So if you wanted to use it for a proxy for something, you could use it as a proxy for something where I'm getting more activation with this exercise than I'm getting with some of the other standard exercises that I use. But as far as the pump itself being a catalyst for muscle growth, that's
yeah. That was sort of my point.
proxy would be like, this is a decent exercise choice for me to use for that particular muscle.
And with rest times, like people get so obsessed and overthink rest times. I just tell people. I remember Dante Trudell telling me this a long time ago when he trained me. He's like, just wait until you're ready.
That's pretty much. I had a few years there where I really had to get people just to get away from the short rests, because the short rests are definitely bad. But the thing is, what we're really looking at with like rest periods is we don't want an interference mechanism that's existing from the previous set. So we want to allow metabolite accumulation to subside so that there's less metabolites from that set that we had just done. And we don't want a cardiovascular demand in place, because that will also create a type of negative afferent feedback to the brain. It says, hey, I'm still basically like, in a cardiovascular demand from that previous set. So if we can allow, the main things I look for is, did my breathing return to normal? Am I kind of recovered from that last set? And then you can kind of go from there. Metabolite accumulation subsides relatively quickly. So, you're still looking at, you guys should know this though, that also depends on the status of the individual. Yeah. So you can do, if you do a heavy set of dumbbell curls, alternating dumbbell curls, I probably need 3 minutes to rest. But if you take a noob who's doing like 20-pound dumbbell curls, he's probably fine after 45 seconds to a minute.
Yeah.
But I actually don't know the answer to this. The cardiovascular demand, if you do short rests, is that going to elevate AMP-K or mTOR would be down because of that? Probably, right? Because of the body
those things always get tied back into, if there's a reduction in motor unit recruitment, we're not climbing back up to the top of that motor unit recruitment scale. So that means any type of, when we see those larger expressions, like we talked about earlier, of any type of down signaling, when we work our way back to whatever it is that's kicking those off, the larger the fiber types that we can recruit in a set-by-set basis means the larger the amplitude of those initial down signaling mechanisms are going to be. So if there's a cardiovascular demand in place, Paul, we did cover this one at first. The other thing is that we end up doing is we can create some fatigue at the autonomic nervous system level. Yep. So that's another reason why we don't want to continue to have cardiovascular demands on a set-by-set basis. We just, that's a good thing. It's another reason why I don't do high reps, is like, we're creating more of a cardiovascular demand. We're creating more calcium ion-related fatigue. We're creating more metabolic stress-related fatigue. So bringing those things back and working into those rep ranges where we can get heavier loads and not have as much recovery demands on a set-by-set basis are going to make those subsequent sets more effective. So, that is kind of a thing, is we want to have enough recovery between sets, but then kids will ask me stuff like, so is it okay if I rest 5 minutes? I'm like, what did you do in 7 reps that needs 5 minutes before you need to get
How out of shape are you?
Yeah. like if you're that out of shape, dude, to do some cardio on your off days, like you said, Kirk, I think that's a gem you said earlier. I think that most guys just they're so busy chasing the stimulus, and I'm going to do like a weird pivot here, but I just thought you said some gold earlier. If you're training 3 or 4 days a week, upper lower split or full body or whatever, you're doing cardio on off days, that is literally the bread and butter of what you can do right there. I saw a little clip from Dorian yesterday. I thought more people should see that. The interviewer asked him, pick 10 exercises for growth.
Mm-hmm. Did he say cardio?
He was like a leg extension, like a hack squat or a leg press, and then a calf raise. And then he's like a chest press and fly, and then like a pull down and a row, and then he goes, a bicep curl, pick any one of them, it doesn't matter. And then I thought that was really good, right?
Yeah.
And then he said a tricep push down, and he stopped for a minute, and he goes, if the average guy just did that twice a week on a split,
it would be big.
And I was like, dude, there's so much gold right there, just like that 30-second piece that guys miss.
You said something in one of your posts months ago. You said something about, someone was asking about, hammer, this grip for easy bar versus straight bar. And you said, if your arms aren't 18 inches at least without being fat, then get them that big first and then worry about the specific curl you're doing. It doesn't matter. It's like, you see, the guys that do the most curls in the gym always have the smallest arms. It's inversely correlated. The guy who does 40 sets of bicep work has 12-inch arms.
The funny thing about growing up with magazines is back in the bicep routines, it's like a dude doing 5 exercises, basically all doing the same thing. He's doing elbow flexion, loading it at some different range of motion. And now I'm like, if you're just trying to grow biceps, anything that loads the elbow at the bottom is going to grow your biceps as much as they're going to grow. And it's pretty wild. You end up, once you start breaking this stuff down and realizing the simplicity of it all, is like there's some muscles you only have one thing you can ever do for them. So if you want to grow biceps, you just got to load them closer to elbow extension. There's nothing else you can do. You can load some supination, but for calves, you have one exercise. One exercise, Kurt.
You need to be straight.
One exercise for calves.
And it's funny because guys will, you have so many gems. You're like, so you do heavy calf raises, standing calf raises, to whatever, and you say, and repeat for a decade, and then you have big calves. This guy's like, but I want them by next week. How do I get them by next week?
I've got some giant calves, and all I've ever done is standing calf raises.
It's the only thing you can do.
And biceps.
The soleus work when you do any other leg exercise in your knee.
The soleus, when you do the standing calf raise too, though.
But I mean, if you leg press, you squat, your soleus gets work when you bend your knee.
My arms are.
Soleus works when you're in a mid range. So anything like a leg press or a squat, or whatever, the soleus still gets work because you go from a dorsiflex to a plantar flex in the mid range. So I'm like, you don't even need to do soleus work, but literally, it's like the only thing you can do for your gastroc is just hold it in the stretch, come back up to neutral. That's it.
Yeah, which that too gets lost. The most guys that have the tiny calves do neutral up, right? They don't ever drop.
Yeah,
you got to go backwards, go down, don't go up. Calf doesn't have any tension when it's up.
I just have everybody focus on the stretch. That's why I'm like, I'm not anti-stretch. I stretch for the muscles that benefit from it. So like hold the stretch, come back up to neutral. And I implemented in my groups consistently wide a year ago, and everybody's got calves. And I've said forever, it's like, I don't think calves are genetic. Or let me say this. I don't think that
there's a limiting factor in their growth.
I don't think there's genetic.
I don't think any muscles are genetically limited. People don't work it. Every guy that has small calves either does them at the end of a workout or they don't do them at all. They're like, my calves suck when you train them.
Imagine that.
Once a month, I do it at the end of a leg workout, but I barely do the leg workout too. I do like one set of leg extensions, and then I do one set of calves, and I'm on my phone, and then I go home. And my calves are really tiny. I don't know why they don't grow.
I was going to ask you guys about this one too. This is another one I've thought about that kind of drives me nuts. Is I see a lot of guys in bodybuilding that have zero ab development, and like none. And everybody's obsessed with doing crunches for abs. And I think abs have been a strength of mine. And what I changed with my ab training a few years ago, and this is one I got from Dante, another one from Dante. He's like, find a machine. I use the hammer strength machine, and I just train my abs heavy. And my abs got nice and thick and chunky and I was like, it was like, be like,
Paul.
When I get really lean, my abs are super thick.
But you don't train them normally, though, right? I didn't for a long time until I got a hernia, and then I do this. I lay on the reverse hyper backwards, face up.
Oh,
I hold a plate, a 45-pound plate. My abs are pretty thick too. Just because the same thing, but I'm doing like 6 reps. I'm not doing like sets.
That was another right. People like there's certain muscle groups. People were like, you can't do heavy lateral.
Oh, it's slow twitch. You got to work your forearms in 50 reps.
Yeah, like the soleus is 90% slow twitch. I'm like, well, do you understand how the side works? Every muscle in your body ends up growing when it comes to like rep ranges and stuff. I mean, if you I tell guys that if you want to get as maximally big as possible, especially natty guys, I'm like, break every 6 rep max that you have on every exercise, and you'll maximize your growth over the course of 8 or 10 years.
And if you look at, like, again, to go back to Dante, really pioneered, I think, simplifying a lot of this stuff, for the average person too, because he was like, you see these guys doing majoring in the minors, doing all these ridiculous little things. He's like, for your shoulders, why are you doing 5 exercises? Just press. There's no guy with big shoulders that doesn't. I'm not against lateral raises, those things, but it's just funny when you actually think about it. The natural guys tend to do all this junk volume for no reason.
The natural guys have been the worst about doing, because they will say those low volume routines are only best for enhanced guys. I'm like, no, it's opposite. It's best for you, bro. So, like, the few things that Dante really nailed, I think that he moved people back, in the early 2000s, was to get focused back on beating the logbook is progressive overload. So you got people back to focus on beating the logbook progressive overload, and then reducing their volume. And those are 2 things, man. If you think about it, at the core, I don't think you need the rest pause. I don't think that you need.
There's no proof.
Well, he's even gotten away from that, talking to him recently.
I think
you got me away from Paul. You got me away from doing any sort of enhancer. I just that's now.
Yeah, and that was a shift in my own stuff. Is like, the more that I started to look at that, I'm like, now here's the fair to speak. Some people will say stuff like, Paul just repeats Chris. I'm like, I got articles in Teenage that go back 12 years, talks about the fact that you have to be careful with intensifiers, because they are going to create an enormous amount of fatigue. Now, the type of fatigue I didn't know then, now I know a lot more, understand more, basically from a physiological standpoint, the type of fatigue we're dealing with and what's really happening there. But really good training, and I said this on the table talk, really good muscle growth training is super boring looking on paper. It's super boring looking on paper. It's pretty low volume. It's anywhere from about 4 to 8 reps, some sets to failure, some sets 1 to 2 RIR, progressively overload those. Pick some stable exercises and focus on that stuff. And no, it's not everything in a stretch position. Lats definitely don't grow more in a stretch. Triceps definitely don't. There's a multitude of muscles that don't grow more in the stretch. Most everything you're going to grow longitudinally is going to grow more in those mid-range muscle positions at a moderate length muscle, where they have
known that for years. There were tricep studies from 20 years ago, 30 years ago showing that.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff, they'll say that too. They'll say, well, that study is 30 years old. I'm like, so?
Didn't change.
Doesn't physiology still works.
Yes, that's the testosterone studies you quoted before from 1996.
Yeah.
Changed. Testosterone
Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. Those are still applicable to today. So, yeah, the training that, bringing us full circle back to why we were going to talk about this was, that is I want people to really, this is going to brush up against, Kerr, you should know this is going to brush up against so many people, and they're going to fight back on this. And if you go and understand that there's 2 different stimuluses going on, one from training and one from your cycle, and they don't have anything to do with each other. And then the other part I was going to get back to is your androgens don't increase the magnitude of stimulus you're getting from your training either. So they don't amplify mechanical tension or mechanical transduction. Like, that's not happening.
They can't.
It's a completely separate, those are separate things. Guys would do themselves such a big favor if they just stop fighting this issue and understand, okay, we have one side where we're getting a stimulus for growth that's happening by completely different mechanisms than this other side. So what you need to learn is on this side, the training side, that is what is going to work best from a physiological standpoint from all the data that we have over decades and decades and decades. So we know that basically there's a point of diminishing returns of volume, that every set you do is going to be less stimulating than the previous one. So you don't really need a lot of volume in the course of the week. And then you also need to know that there's, like we were talking about earlier, that was my shift there, is that something like a bro split is going to be less advantageous for your training gains. So we could probably separate them out, Kurt, between your androgen gains and your training gains. So your training gains are the same. They're going to be the same whether you're natural or enhanced, because they're coming from this particular type of stimuli. So your training gains are going to come by going in, doing 1 or 2, potentially 3 sets for that muscle in this session, and then repeating that in anywhere from, so if you're doing a full body split, you're repeating it every 2 days, or an upper lower where you're repeating it every 3 days. Those are going to be probably your best two approaches. If you were doing an upper lower 3 times a week would still work pretty okay. You could get away with a little bit more volume there where you're doing maybe 2 or 3 sets for a muscle, but then you're still hitting it every Monday, fourth day, right? It's the fourth day, so your fourth or fifth day. Those are really going to be kind of your 3 best approaches. And then figuring out your androgen cycle that's going to give you, like I said earlier, the maximum amount of return with the minimal amount of sides and health deficits. So if your androgen cycle is causing you, when Meadows with Life, you say this too, you say, if you're having to take more shit because of your side effects, then your cycle's wrong.
Yes.
Right? If you have to take stuff for your side effects, basically almost period, then your cycle's probably wrong. Unless you're competing at the Olympia.
Yeah, no, but you're right. That 99% of the time, most guys aren't competing, and that's at the end anyway. Yeah,
we just have to talk in a way that's realistic now, because the truth is, kids are going to be on there, which is just mind-boggling to me. Because, dude, they're working in a hormone prime for their life. They're never going to get again.
Nope.
And they could be maximizing. They could figure out the part I was just talking about there. What is training?
Does that take effort?
Really effective training look like when I'm not on anything, but have a good base hormonal cycle?
That's why I waited until my body went the other way, because I thought I was doing myself an injustice by jumping on drugs when I didn't need them. I was competing.
I waited a long time. I've been training a long time by the time I go on. Like I said, I 100% maxed out everything I could get natural. Without a doubt. I know that. And I guess I don't regret that. My thing is, I probably could have got on quite a few years before, because I had been same as you. I started going backwards because by the time that I got my test levels checked, I was 98 or something. It was really low. But I knew then there was something wrong, because of the fact is that my body was not responding to my diet. My training was it was really bad. I felt pretty terrible. My sleep was bad. I was in a bad mood all the time. As soon as I got on my TRT, I felt like a new person within a few days, 2 or 3 days of the first shot I ever got. I was it's like the lights came back on.
Oh, 100%.
That's the best way I can explain it. It's like the lights came back on. I felt good. I was in a good mood. My sleep was good. My sex drive was normal. So it was I came off altogether, even off my TRT dose, which is really low. I think it was a year and a half ago for 6 months, and I want to see what happened. I didn't really change a ton as far as my body went. My training didn't really look much different, but I felt horrible after about 3 months. I felt pretty rough. And then it got worse the longer it went on. And then I pushed it all the way, got my blood work done for the quarter. My test levels had completely bottomed out. I could actually show them, and I think I did. And but you would never be able to go back and look and find what videos that was where I got off, because other than just how I feel, I've never noticed any difference in what's going on.
Probably because you built most of your tissue without the drugs, right? So the more tissue you build with drugs, the more drugs it takes to keep that tissue. So I naturally tapped out at 180-ish, and I've taken it to almost 240 with drugs. I float around, I'm closer to between 210 and 220 now is where I feel the best. There's no way I would hold that weight with this level of body fat without the drugs. I would go right back to 180.
Yeah. Are you running a replacement dose now?
I am currently, yes. I just came off a bigger cycle for the Olympia. So I dieted down to as close as I get to show shape without really suffering.
Yeah.
And then I did a large cycle, and I gained, I pushed really hard, but I did it only for 8 weeks. 8 weeks.
How much size did you gain in the 8 weeks?
13 pounds.
That's awesome.
My body fat didn't go up. So,
See, that's why I've kind of got in the mode. I was thinking about it. I was I'll never get back on. There's no point. But a big part of it is that I run into these people on social media can't ever figure out, Paul, you should know this from the amount of the shit that you've had to take the last. They can never figure out if you're really jacked or you look like shit. They can't ever figure, nobody can ever come to this. So people either still think I'm on. I'm no, if I was on, you would know. So I've almost thought about, I'm going to go back on so people would be oh, okay. So
now you're on.
Yeah.
It becomes very apparent. I generally stay covered up because I'm not looking for attention. Some guy, I don't wear a tank top to the gym. I'm not that guy.
Right.
I don't want the people looking at the veins and stuff.
Yeah. And so I thought I'm going to diet down to a really get near contest level lean, which is much harder when you're not actually getting ready for a contest. I swear to God,
no reward, there's no pressure.
Real thing, bro. Because you're like, if you're getting ready for a show, there's definitely, I think, a different degree of when I was competing.
It's like studying for the exam.
Dude, it's like when you have a show, I'm gonna be naked in front of people, so I better be dick skin peeled. But when you're doing it just like I have a goal, it is a little different. It feels different because you're like, oh, that ice cream's in the fridge.
Yeah, I use the Olympia kind of as my. I have a ton of guys that are competing, so I was dieting with them.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of easy because I felt I related to them better.
Yes,
suffering if I were suffering too. So I wasn't like eating ice cream on the phone while they're have zero carbs.
I'm going the opposite way for the Olympia. I'm going to be fat and happy.
I figured I would get bigger for the Olympia if I could, and it worked. But then after 8 weeks, I was on over 4 grams of gear. It was just like you start.
So at 4 grams, you ran that for 8 weeks, and you gained, what'd you say,
13-ish pounds.
Wow. That's a lot.
I'll send you pictures later.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's incredible. I mean, that's the thing. That's what I
pushed the food hard. Like I did everything. The other Paul, since knowing him, being friends with him, he's really shown me. I've done this forever, and it's easy to tell other people what to do, but sometimes it's hard to take your own advice.
Yep.
He really showed me the importance of really pushing the food. You know what I mean?
Like, not just food, just carbs. Really,
yeah, just carbs. I mean, I was eating like at least 1,000 grams of carbs a day. We've gotten as high as 2,000 grams.
That sounds like heaven.
Disgusting.
That sounds like heaven. I switched it over instead of doing my cheat meals. That was so funny, Paul, when you were in prep and I was posting them up, and you're like, "Stop doing this to me!" Like I didn't do it. And I was posting my cheat meals, but I was like, "If you have to switch. I don't feel like you can, but I think you have to do something more similar to like we were talking about, like Ken Hill, Skip does, where it's like you're going to do a carb load and you do one on the weekend." You actually really do have to minimize your fat intake for the most part.
You'll make your health markers so all sorts of shit if you have the fat up when you do it.
Yeah.
And we see that all the time in every blood work you see. You could tell when guys are eating too much fat because their triglycerides are through the roof.
I can see it
everything is skewed. Liver,
LDL, and triglycerides.
This conversation is so interesting to me because what I used to think anecdotally and from my own blood work was this. I don't think that the dangers, now you guys correct me if I'm wrong, somebody can come at me. I think if you stay lean, do your cardio, keep your fat intake low, your diet's on point, I don't think that the dangers involved with anabolics are as serious. Nope. I think what gets exacerbated is the stuff that's already killing people at an astronomical rate. And then
drinking, smoking, no cardio.
It's like you said earlier, it's 1 + 1 = 3 or 1 + 1 = 5. Yeah. Well, but I think if you're doing cardio, I had a buddy of mine.
Think about it, though. Think about this. Can I stop you for a second? Think about this. Like, this is the way I look at it. When you're on PEDs, think about what every bodybuilder dies from. It's some sort of cardiovascular event. Heart attack, stroke, blood clots, arrhythmias. And I feel like and most of that's just from shit diet. Like, it's high blood pressure.
Cardio. Yeah.
It's no cardio.
I do cardio
it's
every
from
day
elevated lipids. Clotting factors going through the roof, things like that. I mean, if you can manage all that stuff, I think you can be pretty safe if you're intelligent about things. If you can keep,
I don't want to cut you off there, Paul. This is something I've just been spitballing in my head for years, and I thought that if you look at the guys that are still alive and longevity stuff, most of those guys did cardio, took care of themselves, had better diets. Frank Sains, even Arnold,
Bob Paris did cardio every day.
Yeah, so that's
healthy.
Stallone, Stallone's been running gear for forever and a day. He's like 77 now or whatever.
Yeah. 78, I think.
And I think the issue lies in a multitude of other problems. If you want to take gear, I think even in high amounts, if you're on top of your cardio, if you're taking your coenzyme Q10, your ubiquinol, if you're taking natural statins like you can do with red rice yeast, if you are not ingesting a bunch of saturated fats, if you know what I mean, if you're doing, in other words, it's all the same stuff you would tell a guy to optimize his health without steroids. So if you're optimizing, the one guy I really like right now competing, I feel like talks about that a lot, is Wesley Visser.
Yes.
Wesley.
I love that dude so much. I feel like he's always talking about optimizing your health. And I think what he's getting at there is like you really just are going to avoid all of these pitfalls that most of these guys run into when you're constantly optimizing your health.
Well, both Kurt and I have talked to Wesley.
Yeah, he's a super great guy. And you know what? It's funny because he comes at it from such a different point of view than most bodybuilders. Like even my wife relates to he's probably the only, if you ask my wife to name a pro bodybuilder, he's the only one that she can name. He actually respects the fact that he is a family guy and he takes care of himself. And he's nice.
That's the other thing is like every time I go watch his stuff because he's so relatable. He's always out doing cardio with his kids and he's got the little kids. He's always talking about all the vegetables he eats for health and the supplements he uses for health. And I think that a lot of people are missing out on the really fantastic message that he's giving because it's that if you optimize your health, then you can take a big cycle and completely minimize your risk factors.
Yeah.
Well, you aren't going to grow if you're sick. That's just simple as that.
Yeah. So I just found, I have my blood work done at the end of that cycle. So I'm surrounded by doctors all day long. So they're all very aware of what I do and I'm honest with them. They love to bust my chops with them when they see my labs. They like, they're like, well, we want to say something, but we can't really say anything because nothing wrong with you. My triglycerides were a 64. That was on 4 grams a year, including an oral. And my cholesterol was 102.
Yeah, and the other thing, Paul, you talk about this a lot as well. The other one that I learned when I was on is that even if your blood work is coming back good, if your blood pressure is high, you're dying. So you don't. I had a guy come to me who was running a cycle, getting ready for a show, and same conversations. Even though I've been off for 10 years and kind of done a little bit of a mind dump on a lot of the information. Because most of my stuff's been more physiology about mechanics related. But he came to me and said his cholesterol levels were really bad. And he goes, do you have any recommendations? And I'm like, how much cardio are you doing? And he's like, 20 minutes. I'm like, day? He's like, yeah.
A week.
Yeah, it was like 20 minutes. It's like, take your cardio to 45 a day. I go, and what's your diet? He was still doing I also feel like a lot of guys don't realize this, is that you really have to be more mindful of the saturated fat you have coming in when you're on gear.
Yep.
You should take in none. Close to zero as you can get.
Yeah, as close to zero as you can get.
Whitefish.
All the time. Yeah. Polyunsaturated fine mono. But again, if you're on gear, you don't need a ton of fat. What are you using that fat for outside of storing it?
Dude. That's what I was telling him. I'm like, bro,
I take 4 grams of fish oil.
What are you? I said, every gram of fat you have in your diet right there, get rid of. I said, just get rid of all of it.
Today I've had 8 grams of fat so far.
I said, take your cardio to 45. I said, take your cardio to 45. He took his cardio to 45. He dropped his fat out as low as possible. He came back to me a couple months later, got his blood work done. I think it was 6 or 8 months later. Everything had improved. And his body composition hadn't changed a lot, but his blood work had improved. But he also had the blood pressure problem. And his blood pressure came down once he got more serious about his cardio too. So even if you're doing cardio, if you have some of those markers that are high like that, if you're doing 20, I'm like, then maybe that's not enough for you to get the adaptations.
Or make it harder. Like, yes. I hate to say, and I'm not against doing steps, and I think that steps are important, right? We should move, we should walk. It's good for your stress levels. We come from a time when steps weren't counted, and steps didn't count as cardio, right? We walk. I never counted.
You told me about walking for cardio, but they don't get what I walk like.
That's different. Because they're walking on their job. They're walking.
I do a 10-minute mile. I do a 10-minute mile on a walk, and I do it with a weighted vest. I'm like, I'm getting after it.
But that's my point is the guys who are walking around the store, that doesn't count as cardio. Cardio is planned, it's intentional, and you have to be sweating. It's not you're not wearing a dress shirt walking around that count on that as cardio. That doesn't improve your health. That's better than sitting down, but it's not
hard. You have to create those adaptations from
just like lifting weights. You don't go pick up the 10-pound dumbbells and just do that.
In the off season, I like doing HIIT cardio when I have a little more just to get it over with.
I love interval training. I think because you can get it in, you can bust your butt for 15 minutes, get the a little bit of the EPOC. It's not much more than you get from carb, but I think that also there's just something that feels good about being in shape. I just think also something that just feels good about being in shape, and that's also comes back to what we were talking about earlier, that interference mechanism with cardiorespiratory demand between sets. If you don't have as much of that, you can get through your workouts a little bit more effective too.
That's what Justin says all the time, my coach. if you're out of shape, your training's going to suck.
It's going to suck, bro. Yeah, it's absolutely suck. But I think, I mean, to me, like I said, Kurt and Paul, I think that these are a lot of these are really important discussions, because if the discussion about guys killing over and dying from steroids, the other part that I forgot, a lot of the times people don't know that many of these other guys also have other unhealthy life factors that play. You know, they're partiers, or they're taking
partying,
generally a mix of other things, alcohol, or a past history of things, right? You know, it's the other stuff they don't talk about. Just like they're not clear about their steroid use, they're probably not talking about that use either.
Yeah, like I don't, you know, like these people that are out and they're doing, I think Rich Piana, for example, was pretty well known for like doing cocaine or
all the time.
And
Mike Mentzer was a meth addict.
Yeah,
he was literally doing meth. But I think he and Ray both had a genetic heart.
Yeah,
and they died one day apart.
So if you have any of that stuff, sure, you could be talking about exacerbating things. But I've just never. I have too many friends that have been on big cycles for a long time to have no health problems. And I'm not saying that they're going to live to be 90, but I'm saying we also don't. I know it's been a while since we've had a bodybuilder kill over, isn't it?
That one big guy just died last week. That 350-pound guy.
Yeah,
bro, he's 350 though.
It's not as well. That's a whole other thing. It's not as common. It's not as common as it was. I feel like at the end of COVID, there was like a bunch of guys that just dropped.
We all know why that is.
Well, yeah, we can't say that.
Gotta be careful. Can't say it on YouTube.
You can't say
that. I brought that up privately to somebody. I said, everybody, I actually went back and found out. We can't say this, but we know what all of those guys have in common.
I'll bleep the C word out.
Yeah.
You're not wrong.
Yeah. I found that out later. So I was like, well, that makes all the sense in the world. Because like I said, I got too many friends that have been running cycles. I'm talking about 2 decades of big cycles on and off that, you know, have great blood work, have great blood pressure. They don't have their calcium scores good, like no problems.
Yeah, I get mine checked every couple of years.
Yeah.
That guy that passed away last week, it was Ilya Golem. He was one of Rich Piana's guys, and they think that he was loading up on that PMMA, and that's probably what killed him.
That's like the site enhancement oil, right?
That's the site enhancement.
Well, so that seems to be a huge correlation there. That
plastic
oil is destroying people's kidneys and hearts. That site enhancement oil shit that people are putting in.
It's some of the stuff they put in it. There's plastics
it's
in
not
some
just
of it.
That it's the quantity, right? They're using like
how people are going to be lying about their cycle. You know, like we had those people doing stuff, really dumb stuff like DNP as well. And, you know, that's kind of my thing is like, if you're going to run a cycle, man, and people say, if you want to, I think there's intelligent ways to run your cycle. They tie directly in with your diet, with your supplementation, with your cardio. I think you can run a cycle and be perfectly healthy. And I know that seems to go against the grain, but I just think from everything I've personally kind of looked back into, because I'm thinking about, I'm going to do one more. I was like, I think you could actually do this and be just fine, even at large doses. And Kurt, you're kind of reiterating to me what kind of intuitively.
What you asked in the beginning before we recorded, that would be the way to do it if you care about, you know, longevity. There's ways to be more extreme, but that doesn't mean that that's going to work out for your health in the long run.
It's pretty hard to kill yourself on test, Primo, and GH.
Yeah. I mean, well, you couldn't. Yeah. I don't think you could ever kill
people. I mean, it's true. Like I said, I think that when people be like, oh, this guy was taking steroids and died, I'm like, he was also eating 1.5 pounds of red meat a day. You guys remember Mike Matarazzo, and he looked back and died, and I'm like, dude, the dude didn't eat a vegetable for like a decade.
And he never came off 10 grams of gear. He was using grams a day. I mean, you can't.
He also, remember, he talked about the fact that he ate like pounds of red meat a day. I'm like, dude, what do you think's going to happen?
Yeah. Even if you're not on drugs and you eat pounds of red meat a day, you're going to have health problems.
You are going to have health problems.
The carnivore people.
Wasn't he also a drug addict, if I remember right?
Probably.
Most of those guys out there, you know what's the weird thing when I was coming up through the years is like I still equate bodybuilding, even with steroid use, to health, kind of like we're talking about now. It's like you maximize, even if you're taking drugs, you maximize your health. right? You can do that, Kurt. You can maximize.
I've dedicated my life is dedicated now to proving that point. That's why this
I think you can do that. And I think guys like Stallone, who've clearly been on cycle for decades and decades and decades, but then they're also about trying to figure out ways to maximize their health. But I think that one of the things that was weird to me when I was like a teenager coming up through this is when I find out guys like Craig Titus were out there that were just basically like, they're just like partiers. You know, I know Craig, he also went to prison for killing somebody, but I'm saying a lot of these guys are into lifestyles that I wouldn't even drink. I wouldn't smoke weed. I wouldn't do anything that affected.
Marcus Rule smoked a pack of Marlboro Reds a day.
Yeah.
He's still alive.
Yeah, no, but I'm saying, but like, there's videos of him smoking cigarettes outside the gym.
If anybody should be dead by now, it should be Marcus Rule, right?
I remember it, dude. I bought his video, his training video, and it is the funniest fucking shit. Back like in 2005, and he was smoking cigarettes between sets and eating just pounding fast food.
And he used to eat cake, I think, at some of his meals due to save calories.
Do you remember Jay had that story about Nasser where they were out and Nasser was eating all this cheesecake? Did you ever hear that story?
No.
Yeah. So they were like a few weeks out from the Olympia, and Jay was talking about how they were out somewhere, and I can't remember I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but Nasser was like just pounding cheesecake. And he's like, Jay's like, what the fuck? And so Jay goes in the next day to the gym, and Nasser's in there doing cardio. And then it's like 3 hours later, Nasser did like 3 straight hours of cardio or whatever at the time. But that's kind of, you know, my thought was when I got started lifting and I was really, they sell you in the magazines that bodybuilding is about health and fitness and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. You got all these dudes that are running gear, but they're also like we were talking about before, like they're out partying, doing cocaine, doing ecstasy, doing all this stuff and, you know, getting drunk and who knows what else they're doing. What was the other one, the big one in the New Bane? That was the other one. There's like all these other New Bane was for like a pain.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember everybody was doing that back in the early 2000s.
Yeah. And so there's all of these other factors they would bring in, which was weird to me because I'm like, dude, to me, the whole thought was getting jacked, being shredded, being in amazing health.
They're more extreme.
Yeah. I think that's why when you see somebody like Dorian's in his 60s now, still looks fantastic and talks about health.
Taking any of that crap.
He had some pictures. You guys said there's shirtless pictures of him.
Yeah, he looks good.
He looks fantastic still.
I interviewed his ex-training partner. We went through and detailed all of his training. Like he went through and told me exactly what they did. If Paul Baxendale, if you ever want to talk to him,
he's really cool.
He is great. Yeah, you would love talking to him. You should check out. I have the videos. We went through each one of their workouts and talked about what they really did versus what was in the book.
Yeah.
And stuff. And Dorian was very intelligent, man. Like it was crazy how he just figured shit out.
Yeah, he was super intuitive. What were kind of some of the differences in what they were actually doing and what he was saying?
Not a whole lot of difference, you know, stuff that was in the book. He said that you know, initially that they would do top sets and back off sets. That's kind of what.
So when Dorian first hit the scene, a lot of people don't remember this. I read everything that came out by him. He always did back off sets at first. He would do, and if you go and get his original book, if you can find it, you can go to the scribbling where he wrote in his journal, and he almost always did a back off set, or not always, but what he was actually doing looks a little different than what ended up getting pushed into print later.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what you and I are saying. It's like what he was doing in training was more like 1 or 2 sets per exercise.
Yes.
Instead of like the whole kind of everybody's bastardized his stuff. But when he was actually writing, when he wrote the journal and put that out there and you could find the pieces of the journal, it looks a little different than what you find online.
Yeah.
Where they
any of that stuff does. Mike Mentzer's stuff has been bastardized too.
Yeah, there was a guy that commented on my that actually was working out in the same gym as Mike and talked about stuff that Mike did, and it was different, not entirely like a whole other world different, but it was different enough that you can kind of get the sense that these guys were pushing principles, but what they were doing in their training was a little different too.
Yeah, I just interviewed Larry Pollock this week. I'll put it up. But Larry lived with Mike. He was roommates with Mike. He had some crazy stories about Mike. It was insane. But yeah, Mike's training was a little different than what it was in the books. Like later on, he got into that crazy shit, like once every 14 days and all that stuff. And
he was not
Mike's early training, in my opinion, is really good. His early training, get rid of the superset. Same muscle group supersets are pointless. But if you get into his earlier kind of where he kind of almost had an upper lower type split going on.
Yeah.
Training 4 days a week.
4 times a week. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was good stuff.
If you go look back at what he called his most productive split, it's really spot on.
The only thing that was off, I think, is he did the pre-fatigue for the chest, which was weird. Right? Like he did the flies first and then, which I guess you could do, but
he was doing those as supersets.
Okay.
So that same muscle supersets are stupid.
Yeah.
So
I was
just get rid of those. And yeah, you're right. Flip flop the press and the fly.
Yeah, that just doesn't make
sense. And you got a pretty much spot on routine.
Yeah.
I was laughing.
They didn't have the science back then, right? And he was on enough gear. Goes back to our original topic that you're on 2 grams of Deca, you're going to grow regardless of what the hell you're doing in the gym. Right? He was eating muffins and stuff for breakfast. It didn't really matter what he was doing.
I was laughing. Larry said
he was the original if it fits your macros guy.
Yeah. Well, he was like his diet's ridiculous. It was like toast with butter, orange juice, 3 muffins, like fried chicken and French fries, and ice cream for dessert.
I was laughing when I talked to Larry this week. Larry said when he first met him, he said I saw this little guy with this weird voice and 12-inch arms and a pot belly, and I'm like, is this Mike? And he said he chain smoked. And then he said that like I got him back into the gym. I paraphrase, I could be off on some of the details, but he said Mike would use meth and 2 shots of espresso for a pre-workout, and then he'd get on his Deca cycle, and he said like 10 weeks later, he said he would be like 300 pounds.
So I can do an absolutely 100% spot on Mike Munster impression. Yeah, I've done it on my podcast a few times. People want me to do it all the time. I whooped it out one day just randomly on my podcast, and I shocked myself. And Chris was like, "Wow, that's really good." And then everybody else who heard it after was like, "Dude, you have to do that more because I can actually do his voice like 100% spot on." So, but I have to get into character. I'll try to give it to you on the podcast here a little bit. So, let me see if I can do it. Because doing a voice, you have to get into character, right? So, it's the stimulus that you're going to get out of doing so many sets for your muscle is going to come back to how many times you're going to go into the gym. If you do 1 set, the maximum amount of stimulating repetitions you're going to get out of doing both. There you go. So
that's a pretty good Mike Mincer.
I've done it better, but I have to know what I'm going to say ahead of time. But I mean, I can do his voice pretty good. But I used to talk on the phone when I was a kid too. I talked to Mike on the phone.
Oh, really?
He's going to pay for phone consults, right?
No, I didn't. He was so nice. I would call. Mike really loved training. He really loved bodybuilding, and I was like 15 years old. And I would call, and he wouldn't even make me pay for the consultation. He would just talk to me and tell me, yeah. So it was really amazing to be able to have that. I think we did 3 or 4 calls, and he even responded to some letters I wrote to him. He was a really, really nice person.
It was sort of sad to see what happened to him. He just kind of declined in mental illness and drug addiction at the end.
Yeah, and I also think that Mike had most of that stuff as far as like his training stuff was really spot on early, and then he lost his way a little bit. Like you were saying, Kurt, when he got into the whole don't train chest but once every 14 days, and he's like people can't recover as well as they think they can, and just said the most amount of stimulus that you can take in a session is this much, and then you're going to have to recover for 72 days after that before you can train the muscle again. So it was kind of like that, right? So you went from being pretty close, you're like, hey, dude, you're really close to stuff that's going to come up 50 years from now. It's going to be spot on to like, you went way past.
Yeah, I think that was when he was probably in his peak meth phase when he kind of lost it there at the end. You'll like this this Larry Pollock interview I've got coming up. It'll be on this week. You guys will like this one. This one, there's a lot of fun, juicy Mike stories on here.
They didn't do cardio in the 70s. That's why a lot of
No,
those
they
guys,
just train. They just train more.
so that was that. A lot of people do not realize when they would read Arnold's old stuff, and Arnold would talk about training twice a day and 6 days a week, and all they were doing, people did not realize what intuitively they did was they increased the amount of work they were doing to get lean.
Increase their NEAT. Yep.
All they had to do was do cardio. So all they had to do was do cardio. But I think Mike had figured out it was just the diet. He was definitely ahead of his time in some ways because he was getting what they had at the time, contest level lean, which is pretty much off-season level lean, what we consider for bodybuilders now. Yeah. It's their contest level lean, pretty close to it, right? Maybe a little fatter. But Mike had just figured out was all the calorie stuff. And here's the thing. The other part that you brought up, Paul, to make sure we hit on all the topics is the protein intake. And you were like, I don't always get a gram of protein intake a day. And I think that protein intake has been so overstated by the industry as a whole. Yeah. No bodybuilder out there is lacking on protein intake. None of them. Like none. I think the general pop, that was the thing with the general population for a long time, was protein intake, that it got extrapolated over into the fitness community. I'm like, look, bro, nobody in the fitness world is lacking on protein intake.
No. And I think all the coaches now pretty much have everyone reduced. I have all my guys cut it down. The days of the 300, 400 grams of protein is over.
No one's, for the most part. There's a few people hanging on to that.
Here's a problem, Kurt, that we had. And not to throw Dante under the bus here, but he promoted that for a decade.
Well, everybody was at that point.
He was like, all the most massive guys are eating, 400 grams of protein a day. Well, when they finally got around to doing a hyperfeeding for protein and actually doing measurements, direct muscle measurements, they're like, it does nothing. So once you hit a threshold, and it's pretty low, once you hit a threshold, you're getting whatever you can get out of it.
And that's the same as, like, just because they were all doing it doesn't mean that that's what's causing them to be huge.
Well,
all those huge guys were also on grams of gear. So what, like, was it the
I wonder if that played a part.
Grams of gear?
Do you think it was the 3 grams of gear or the 300 grams of protein?
If I'm going to spend $50 on a bottle of test or $50 on a bottle of protein, which is going to yield more muscle?
I will use protein though sometimes on contest prep with people just for satiety. Like I'll
there's times to do it, but we don't. I don't think anyone's eating that much, right? If you eat an adequate amount of carbohydrates for your body, whatever you need, generally.
But the other thing, and I'll give you guys this little gem here. So, Alan, you guys who know who Alan Aragon is, right? Like Alan's he's kind of like I call Alan the king. When it comes to nutrition, Alan's pretty much the king. They were doing all those studies. You bring up carbohydrates. I think carbohydrates are the least appreciated of the macros when it comes to what's going on with your body.
Everyone's terrified of them. They are the most important.
You guys are killing me today because it's true, man. Like the stuff you read, but they did all those keto studies and nobody could gain muscle on keto, even in a surplus. Nobody could gain muscle on keto in a surplus. So the reason why that this happens is because when your glycogen depleted sufficiently, you suffer from excitation, contraction, coupling failure. So what that means is, at a very get nerdtastic again, at the neuromuscular junction where the voltage sensor, which basically reads the electrical signal that comes down from the spine and the sarcolemma and stuff, what has to happen then is that voltage sensor has to be able to talk to the calcium ion store and says, I need to do a muscular contraction, give me some calcium ions so we can fuel some muscular contractions. That process gets broken, and that's excitation, contraction, coupling failure. So those fibers cannot experience mechanical tension. They can't produce force. When you're doing a keto diet, you're basically suffering from excitation, contraction, coupling failure all the time. So when they put those guys in a surplus, so I sent over to Alan, and Alan's a super sharp guy. And he goes, oh man, that's the mechanism. And I'm like, right. That's why you can't really gain mass in keto.
And that's with mechanotransduction. That's with the natural stuff. Even on steroids, if you're in keto, your liver's not going to produce IGF. It's looking for glucose and insulin. If your insulin's not present, your glucose is under 100. Your liver's like,
the other thing, Kurt, we had Joe Agu on our podcast too. Him and Alan are the two guys. And it's actually quite difficult to store carbs as fat. And people don't talk about
It's very, it's
very
almost damn near impossible.
All of China would be morbidly obese.
Because I'm like, dude, so fat's the buffer. If you got a bunch of carbs and a bunch of fat, even if you eat a higher fat diet, your body will more readily store that fat as fat.
Yep.
Of course.
So
Yep.
I'm like, you got one or two options. You either go to a protein-sparing modified fast where you strip both of them out, and then you just rely on your stored body fat stores, or you eat carbs and you retain your muscle or build muscle. But carbs are really the macro for adjusting everything.
Yes, it's the only one that Paul and I, it's the only one that we move with clients is carbs. Everyone else is it. And Lane Norton said Lane Norton said it really well. He said, if you eat more carbohydrates, you store more carbohydrates as glycogen, because that's where carbohydrates are stored, and you burn less fat, right? But you burn more glucose. If you eat more fat, you store more fat, and you burn more fat. What it comes down to the total energy balance.
Think of burning fat as
burning fat and losing fat.
And that's not the same. No.
Not the same thing.
I try to. I don't even get into nutrition, guys, because I try to specialize in physiology.
You think people get angry about training? Oh my God, people get really super angry about nutrition.
Oh yeah, they get mad as hell about all of it, but they really get beside themselves about. Some people still, I think, hold on to the insulin to obesity model that
was proven 30 years ago now.
Yeah, they've been disproving that for a long time. What was his name? Taubes lost $30 or $40 million over the course of his business life trying to prove that insulin increases caused fat storage. And the thing is that carb manipulation, and I was talking to a friend of mine this morning who got peeled for his show. I mean, peeled. And his moderate day of carb intake is 550 a day.
Yeah. What did you eat, Paul?
I was doing 500 on my medium days, and my high days were up as high as 2,000 on contest prep.
Going into show to win a pro card. You're not going to get fatty.
What's that?
Yeah, it was. I think he said his high day was 1,000 and his medium day was 550. His low day was only 150.
Yeah, my low day was over 200.
Yeah. So if you're on,
but my fats were,
nothing.
Yep, they were low.
But the thing is, if you're eating, and it's kind of a semi cheat diet cheat code, is if you strip all your fats out. If you're on androgens, the cheat code with androgens is this. I remember when Matt Porter was like, it's like he said this: as long as you're on, he's like, you're never going to lose muscle. So you can pretty much shred your fats down to nothing and just do what you want with your protein and carbs. And you don't need a lot of protein, right? So you're just manipulating carbs. It's so funny to hear you guys talk about this because I've known this for a while, but I've never talked about it openly. I'm like, you're really just doing carb manipulation. So any type of carb cycling that you're doing is where you're getting either your gains or your fat loss at. And then protein, you don't need a lot of. Like, why the obsession with protein is wild to me. I'm like, the 0.7 to 0.8 is about right.
Yeah.
Well, you think about it. What happens to the excess?
Technically, you might be able to utilize more, but you technically need less because you're not losing it. It's not being broken down the same rate.
Yes.
So
also, what the hell happens to the excess protein you eat anyway?
Glucose.
It gets turned into glucose.
Expensive carbohydrate. It's very expensive carbohydrate.
The excess gets turned into minor amounts of glucose, and then you shit and piss the rest out.
Yeah. I mean, the conversion of glucose, you're making like 5 grams an hour, and it's very low, but still. Yeah, like
you'll see it in blood work too. Like their bond will be through the roof from all the excess protein. It's crazy.
Yeah, and everyone, I think all the good coaches have changed their process with this. I mean,
the guy that kind of had
30 grams a day, 30 grams a meal now. It used to be 50 or 60 grams.
You just don't need that.
No one's eating that much anymore.
You just don't need that much. I mean, you can get by with a cup of egg whites and one whole egg for breakfast. And then I just think if smart people that are working their diet are really they're just manipulating their carbs for the most part. And then if you are like Paul, what were you, 250 on stage?
250, yeah.
250. And you were eating how much protein a day?
Between 250 and 300, yeah.
Yeah. So,
and that was on prep off season. It's lower.
Yeah, because you got all the carbs.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I mean. So if you're on, and I've told that guys this forever too. I'm like, well, if you're on, just pull all your fats out. You don't need them. A natural guy has to keep his fat.
A little bit, yeah, but what is the amount? It's low. It's really low.
I keep some EFAs and some DHA and EPA.
It's like 20%. It's
40
super
or
low.
50 grams a day.
And they're not all equal. That's the other problem, is all fats are not equal, right? Really what your body's looking for. The only two essential fatty acids are ALA and LA, but you technically don't even need those. That's flaxseed oil. You really just need DHA and EPA for radius shit.
Yeah, so 3 or 4 times a week have some fresh Atlantic salmon.
Yeah, I use the Biotest fish oil. I take 4 of them a day. And I've like I said, I'll be on my 5th meal when we get off this call. I've had 8 grams of fat all day, and 4 of those grams is fish oil.
I do 2 high potency fish oil pills and 2 flax pills every day.
Like, what else do you need?
You can strip all the fat out of your diet, hit fish oil a couple of times, or you can eat, like I said, or you can get. Yeah. I like fish, so if you can do some fresh Atlantic salmon. And get your omega-3s in that way. And I mean, it's all this stuff. That's why I like the nutritional stuff. I stopped really getting into it because I don't even find it interesting.
It's frustrating. It's super frustrating. Yes, because it's so simple, first of all, right? Like, everyone gets so hung up on it. It's actually really easy.
I think the nutritional stuff is so easy.
But it's where people struggle because they can't do it because it takes discipline. It takes effort to wake up and eat the same shit. It takes effort. Like, but look at your diet. You post your diet all the time. I don't ever post my diet. People ask me all the time because I have a wacky metabolism. You can ask Paul. I eat a lot of food. And it just doesn't, when people post what they eat in a day, it doesn't relate to any other human on the planet, right? Everyone.
Oh my God.
And it's situational.
Like other spirit animal. I always tell people, they always want to see your diet. I'm like, what I do has no relevance for you.
No.
Nobody wanted to believe that Derek Lunsford was his gaining diet was like 3,800 calories a day or something. And like
work for him. Who cares?
It has nothing to do with you. Nothing.
And it's situational. Sure. What I might eat today doesn't mean that's what I'm eating if I'm prepping. Yeah. I've eaten as low as 1,200 calories. I've eaten as high as 9,000 calories. Does that mean that applies to any human? No.
John, I remember he was going through the last show he did because we talked there pretty much. We talked 2 or 3 times a week for hours at a time. He would call me, and he's like, he sat down and he wrote one diet out. And he's like, if I'm a little hungry, I'll eat a little more on that day, and then if I'm the next day, I might eat a little less,
a little bit, yeah.
And it was really he's just like, I just look at my body and just see, what's going on. And there's kind of both the science and the art, I think, with the diet thing and getting in bodybuilding shape, because yes, it's just a calorie deficit and all that, but it is different for everybody. So some people don't believe like yesterday, like I think 1,400 calories and I feel fine.
Your food's usually pretty low most days.
I feel really good on low.
I feel good when I'm hungry too.
I feel good. I do not like. I remember when Adam McVeigh was alive, and I used to do Geared Up podcasts, and we had Tony on there. Gosh, Tony Friedrich, and Tony was on there. And Tony was like, he liked to be hungry to go into training. I cannot have food in my stomach when I go into training. No. I have to feel just very slightly hungry going into training because I'm always drinking a Perry. Yep. Because I do like to have something to drink during training. Yep. But if I have something in my stomach, I feel terrible during training. But that's different for everybody. Tony, I'd be like, so he literally, I think he was talking about sitting in the parking lot eating Snickers before he'd go into work. I was like, dude, I could never do that. I could never eat a Snickers and then go into training. So there's a lot of variables there that go on. I mean, I do think you have to figure out, okay, what's my maintenance calories? That's going to be different for everybody.
And it changes, right? Your body, like, we're all 50 years old, give or take, right? Mine has changed throughout the years. Yep. And it changes throughout, like, where your body fat is, what your body's doing. Mine is not, I roughly know what I can eat to tolerate to keep my weight the same, but it's not always the same. Sometimes I'll eat that and I'll lose weight. Sometimes I'll gain weight.
Yep. Yeah, it's just there's a lot of variation in there. And there's times I remember like going into one show and I was eating way more than I expected and was still losing at a rapid clip. And then there's other times where I feel like I know I'm got very few calories come in and my body's not. Have you ever had those, Kurt?
Yeah. And sometimes you need a diet break at that point, or something else is going on, right? Or maybe you need to bump the calories up just to see if your body,
Kurt, you tell me, I've gotten, now that I've been contest prepping people for years, I've gotten more so, I don't even have a macro amount that I shoot for with people. I just look at their body and see where they're at. And I just kind of like my diets from, I have like general starting points with people, but like my diets from person to person are wildly different.
Yeah. I mean, I find dieting to be boring, but complex at the same time. Because like you said, curveballs, like what you're doing today that works to get you shredded in a year from now may not work.
No, because ideally you should have made progress, right? Your body should, in theory, have improved in some metric, right? Otherwise, well, I don't know what you're doing with your training. Doesn't mean you're always bigger, because it depends on your goal, right? But training, something should have changed in a year. Very few people I know that are successful at any of the physique stuff or strength stay the same year after year.
No.
Here's a good example of what you're talking about. So a buddy of mine was training this pro bodybuilder, getting him ready for the show, and he was in the military, and but he was retiring. So we went to the last show, peeled, and I want to say he won that show, and it was like 6 months later, 8 months later, he was getting ready for another show, and he didn't hire my buddy. But he finally hired him and said, dude, he goes, I'm using the same diet you gave me last year. And he's like, it's not working. He goes, because you were in the military then, and you were working out. You had a manual labor job. Yeah. So you had all of this extra meat that was going on. So he goes, now you don't, and you haven't compensated with that. That was funny. Tony Friedrich, back to Tony. I haven't talked about Tony forever, but he was telling me a guy he was working with. He's like, his NEAT was so low he couldn't get in contest shape, and that was the other thing you're talking about with. So if you reduce your calories so much, your body really loves homeostasis, and so if you reduce your calories too much, what happens is you'll overcompensate by only doing the cardio you're doing. And then
you sit, you don't pee. I'm on contest prep. There have been times I don't even want to piss. Like you sit on the couch and you're like, I got to go to the bathroom really badly.
I always knew that my
wait another hour.
I ain't washing clothes. No. I would know by how many loads of laundry that I do during the week if I was compensating on my steps. I didn't even need to track my steps. If I wasn't washing my clothes, I'm like, okay, I'm way behind. Because
I get the opposite, man. I get so amped up. You've seen it, Kurt, with me. My metabolism will just run away on prep. It is so weird. Like I can't sit still at the end. I'm not like anybody else, man.
He also reacts favorably to Halo testing, makes him feel good. So he's the only one I know that feel good. Can do Halo.
So I think the couple of things, Paul, that I want to go over. Like Kurt, I think the biggest one here to talk about is, I think you agree with me when I say I don't think you're getting any kind of recovery boost from being on cycle from your training. I think people that are going to get on, I think they need to understand what good training looks like from a physiological standpoint, and then they need to figure out their drug cycle that maximizes those stimulus gains and then minimize side effects. Do you feel like that's an accurate statement?
And that's where the test and primo thing comes from, right? Is that the most effective cycle that you can run? No, nope. I would never say that. I don't think that's accurate at all. But is that the most effective cycle you can run without killing yourself or killing your wife or, harming your neighbor or running over an old woman Yeah, it probably is, because it's going to be effective enough that you're not going to get crazy side effects from, right?
Probably the most effective cycle would be test.
I mean, look, and it's funny because I ended up right back in the same place as Dan Duchaine, because he said that if you go back to the original steroid handbook, he said the most effective cycle you can run is test, tren, and anadrol. And sure enough, here I am 40 years later saying the most effective cycle you can run is test, tren, and anadrol. He was right. He was right all along, but that doesn't mean that you should run.
Let me ask you a question in your thought, Kurt, without getting to the, I know there's lots of variables. If you can't run tren, because I couldn't run tren. I had terrible,
I can't either. I feel like shit.
You run then any class, what you want to combine a class 1 drug and a class 2 drug. So the class 1 drugs are anything that's technically, testosterone's mixed activity. It's both 1 and 2. Class 1 basically means it interacts with the androgen receptor and is causing classic protein synthesis, like similar to lifting. Class 2 are things that don't interact with the androgen receptor that we know of: anadrol, D-bol, and winstrol, the 3 that are class 2. You basically want to combine a class 1, primo, nandrolone, equipoise, whatever, with a class 2 like anadrol or D-bol. And even the guys in the 70s were doing that, and they didn't realize why they were doing it, right? That's why they ran DECA and D-bol and primo, because they were getting a class 1 and a class 2. If you ran just DECA and primo together, it's kind of redundant, the results from it. Like you're just banging on the androgen receptor at the same point. There are other effects that occur, but they're not so grand that you're like, whoa, that was amazing.
What about Masteron?
Masteron, we don't know actually what its activity is. I would say as an anabolic, I would say it's probably falls a little short. I would say Primo would be a better version. Mm-hmm. I would say from a cosmetic point of view, I think Masteron's a fantastic drug. From an anabolic point of view, I would give it like a C or a D. I always find I'm too flat on it, right? You look crazy because you're rock hard, you're dry, but like, you're dry. It's kind of like Winstrol, like a little too dry to be getting strong. I think the ones that the typical anabolics outside of that are EQ, Primo, and Nandrolone are the 3 typical ones outside of test.
Yeah.
Right? But honestly, you could just titrate your test up to a gram. I mean, there's a ton of room to grow with just test.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I could probably speak for Paul Barnett as well. I think being older now, the most dramatic thing for me was growth hormone.
Yeah.
Like it really took my physique to a different place because I'm not producing a ton anymore. Right. I was definitely at a ceiling. I was pretty much capped at the low 200s, and it basically gave me another almost 50 pounds of potential that I would not have had without it. And my quality of life has improved with it too. I don't piss in the middle of the night anymore. I sleep the whole night. It's really changed. My wife used it as well, fixed her knees. You know, again, I think for young kids, unless you're going on the Olympia stage, it's probably stupid. It's expensive. And if you're 20 years old, you really need it unless you're going to be a pro athlete. But I think for guys our age, test and GH, if you can't grow on a gram of test, you know, and like 8 units of growth, something's wrong with you.
Yeah, that was when I was competing. I found that 750 tests, anything over that, I didn't feel like I felt like I maxed out whatever I was doing.
We all have a ceiling with test, and that's when you run another anabolic. So you run 750 tests, and you run whatever amount of another anabolic on top of it. 600 Primo or 600 EQ or 400 Deca, you know, one of those, you know, and then that's the simplest way to do it. I think if you just add another class like an Anadrol or a D-ball, some point in the cycle when you kind of hit that wall, you know, there's always that point in the middle where you're kind of like plateau. And it's like, if you bring your food up, you just get fat. You know, you can't, that's kind of the point that I would leverage. And I never understood when guys introduce an oral in the beginning of a cycle. Like the drugs aren't ramped up yet. Why are you throwing a fast acting thing here when the level of the other stuff is too low still?
Like the oral for the end. Yeah, from when I was on, the oral was the last thing.
Yeah, when you hit a wall and you need to bump it past, you run it the last 4 weeks, 5 weeks, pull the damn thing out, get healthy, then go back to TRT. You should be able to hold that. If you gain 20 pounds, you're going to keep at least 15 of it.
I was going to say, so I still sit in the 240s, 230s, relatively lean all the time. And people were like, well, how are you that big if you're just on TRT? I'm like, because I didn't lose. Like when I came down and I was like fully on, like I would have still been in the 250s, 260s. And I'm like, you don't, we have studies on that now. You don't lose it all. As long as if you're taking a TRT dose and you're training, you're going to keep,
of course,
not all of it, but you'll keep
just like food. Just like food, it takes a lot less food to hold your weight than it does to get there, right? When we all have had to overeat at some point in our time. Anyone who's big, overeat. There's very few guys who can get by a minimum amount of food, get big. But that doesn't mean you have to eat like that now to hold that size.
Nope.
Right? Well, muscle holds what, 600 calories, but it takes 3,200, give or take, to make a pound. 30. I know that's correct.
Yep.
Something like that, right? Because there's an energy requirement there.
Yeah, when it's muscle, I think even maximally for like a noob, I don't remember the figures, but it's really low. It's like, I think it's, what is it? Something like 8 grams a day. Is that what it is? Like you can synthesize. That's like a noob. That's a total noob. Like synthesizing at the fastest possible rate. So it's most of the time people don't realize the magnitude of these things, especially when they're looking at studies, or they'll be like, well, like, I posted up a study. They did a bicep study. It was 6 weeks training biceps. Pretty much all the gains were gone in a week. And everybody was mad at me. I'm like, so if you train biceps for 6 weeks, that's not a very long time to add a tissue accrual. And then those fibers at the top of that motor unit pool, they only get activated when you're training. So how long do you think it takes to atrophy? They atrophy relatively quickly. So everybody was mad at me. They're like, that doesn't go with my observation. I'm like, you're not going to see millimeters of muscle gone from type 2 fibers and like in your like by the eyeball.
Just like you don't see the millimeters of growth.
You don't exactly.
Yeah.
Again, not to quote Mike Mentzer again, but he talked about seeing the scale move. It's like if the scale is visibly moving like week to week and you're not a new lifter, you're just getting fat. That's not muscle. You can't move the scale on a weekly basis.
As crazy as Mike was, it's like now we were getting back to the diet thing. He talked about how little protein and how little calories that you needed to support the need for recovery and anabolism. And he was spot on about it. It's not a lot. So, I mean, we push the food. I think when you're a natural guy, you probably need to learn how to.
One of the only levers you have to pull is food, right? There's not a lot of things you can do.
Yeah, there's really not a whole lot.
When you're enhanced, I'll bring the food up, but I'd rather push within reason, I'd rather push the chemicals up and leverage that thing, right? Because training's already maximized. Like you said, the training doesn't change. If you're not maximize your training, what are you doing?
That was the other thing I was going to say. So I don't think, Kurt, love this talk with you today, since like this is more your area in endocrinology stuff that you kind of arrived here too. Is like I think you're looking at two stimulus, and I don't think that the androgen stimulus is improving.
No crossover.
I don't think there's any crossover. I think people are like, I'm like, yep, if you give me a pro bodybuilder, I'm going to train him the same way I'm training a natural guy and look at their recovery rates and how they're recovering from that program. But I don't think you get on, if you had a solid productive training program naturally, just use that when you get on. You're going to just let the androgens do their work.
Good work. I agree. And that's why my reason for young guys not using drugs is because they probably haven't learned how to eat or train yet. If you're 20 years old, it takes we're all 50. It takes time before you figure this stuff out. If you're that age and you do drugs, now you're leveraging a whole nother thing. You never figured out the trade, and then you come off drugs, and all of a sudden you're like, why don't I grow anymore? Right? Like you're a great example. You fully came off stuff, and you held your size. You're 250 pounds.
Yeah, I didn't really see anything, and that was I did that for that reason. I was like, I'm just going to come completely off, and I want to see what happens. I didn't say anything, but I posted my blood work later, and my test levels were 98. I'm like, nothing really happened, but I feel awful. So I think that's the other thing is that I haven't seen anything in the data that shows that anabolics are creating a faster recovery from any of the apoptosis type damage that we see from the activation of cow pains. Nobody's ever sent me a single thing related to that.
Well, Notch, the gene Notch will affect that, and then the AR does affect Notch. But to what degree, I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, and if it comes down the line, like I'll totally change my stance.
No, I don't have an answer for that. I'm just saying that gene does affect that, and the AR does affect Notch. But like,
it's kind of like we were talking about earlier when we were talking about downstream stuff. We have to get to where just because there's a root in the downstream,
we don't know where that's going.
Where is it going? So those are the two things, and that. To get back to what Paul said about because Paul, you've made your gains have been the last 3 years really impressive, really ridiculous. And you're like, bro, I don't always eat a gram of protein a day and I sleep like shit. And I haven't really progressively overloaded. And you're like, but I still made all these gains. And I'm like, I think your anecdote, Paul, is backing up a lot of what Kurt and I are saying.
Yeah. It's a different mechanism of growth.
It's just a different mechanism.
Not related.
No. It doesn't mean you don't train hard, Paul.
No, that's wrong. But I agree that you can do them separate as total separate things.
Yeah. No, fairness, I'll tell you, I did progressive overload when I was in my 20s, and my joints and connective tissue just can't handle it anymore.
Yeah. And I will leave this there because I don't have an answer. It is rhetorical. If you were to take someone like, I'm just going to use him as an example, but I don't honestly know much about his training. If you took someone like a Jay Cutler and you actually brought him back to that time and you had him train properly, and I'm not trying to insult him. I don't know. I'm just using him as an example. If you had him train like that, science-based, he probably would have even made more progress, right? Because they were leveraging all the other mechanisms and just curling 35-pound dumbbells, right? 20 reps or whatever they were doing. Is that the right? I would guess that you get more progress. So
here's what I would say for people who tell me this. The guys at the upper echelon levels, if they trained more correctly, the magnitude at their level, because you're competing for those 1s, 2s, and 3%, I do think I think you're going to get those 1s, 2s, and 3%. So if you're trying to max out everything, if you're maxing out drugs, if you're maxing out nutrition, if you're doing all those things, and you max out your training from, remember, remove the drug aspect, Kurt. This is so important for this discussion, and remove that stimulus and say we're still talking about a stimulus from the training aspect. From we're converting a mechanical signal into a biological process that causes muscle growth. Would they have had slightly better physiques?
I think so.
Yes.
Science says yes. Right, but we don't know, because none of them ever do that, because what they do is then they leverage volume.
But is that true though, Kurt? Because who turned pro natural? That a lot of people don't even think he was naturally turned pro, and he's considered the greatest bodybuilder of all time.
Ronnie Coleman.
Ronnie.
Did Ronnie max out his natural genetics, you think? I think he did.
So, yeah.
And I think the reason why that Ronnie potentially was so much bigger than everybody else too, not just because they're all hyper responders, is that Ronnie also knew how to train for his body and what was going to make him grow.
Without drugs first.
Yeah. So I do think that you can make the case anecdotally. Dorian was like that for everybody else too, right? Like, and
freak. Yeah.
Yeah. So Dorian trained in a very intelligent manner, and he basically was like smashing everybody else for almost a decade. So I do think there is something to be said for more intelligent training, even when you're on.
And even if you're top genetics, right? Because that is obviously a limiting factor.
Yep. If you're trying to maximize everything at that level, and I want to say a couple of guys right now that I feel like are doing is Hunter Labrada. I think Hunter trains really smart. From what I've
Nick
seen.
Walker seems to have changed his training too. I noticed.
Yeah, I swear to God, I was going to say Nick Walker has changed his training, and I don't think it's a coincidence that his physique has changed quite a bit over the last couple of years since he started to alter his training.
Well, because you can only push the gear so high, right, for so long before health takes a shit.
Yep.
And and I don't want to assume anything, but I'm guessing that's probably something that occurred to him at a certain point.
I don't know who Nick was working with, but the way he talks about training now is different than the way he talked about training years ago. He talks about one or two top sets and getting in and getting out. And I think those guys I think there is starting to become that shift now where people are figuring out volume's not it. It's not where it's going to happen. It's going to be, you don't need that much to grow. And it's far more important to minimize the fatiguing mechanisms that are clearly interfering with the training. So I do think we've had that shift. I do think, I don't like to say this to be arrogant anyway. I do think I've played a part in some of that paradigm shift that's happened.
I would agree with that. I'm a influencer to agree, but I always default to you and Chris for exercise stuff. You absolutely play a role. I mean, you play a role in my decisions and how I teach others when it comes to exercise. You must.
We had those bad days where it just feels like an uphill battle. But I think the difference in what I'm doing, and again, I don't mean this arrogantly. I think the difference in what I'm doing and what a lot of other people are doing is that I get 500 messages a day from guys who are like, I started following you 3 months ago, and I started changing my training based on principles you're saying, and like I've seen the most progress I've seen in 10 years. I get 500 of those DMs a day. And I have thousands and thousands of people in my groups. And as I've changed the metrics and stuff and the approach, the methodologies in the training, that I always look at science this way. Is there a practical application I can get out of this? Because otherwise we're just nerding out the shit that don't matter.
Yep.
Can I look at this and say, here's the practical approach we can put into our training to make guys better? And that's what I've tried to do with that stuff. And so I think that shift that's happened, I do think I've played a part in that. And I do think that we'll finally get away from those decades and decades of volumes a driver. This next one I'll have to tackle is like everything grows better at long lengths, which is not true, but I'll get there eventually. I can't get them all at once.
No, I think you do play a large role in all this stuff. I thank you at least for what you contribute.
Thank you, man. I appreciate that. Legitimately, it means a lot.
I find your information very interesting too. Guys, I got to wrap up. This was an awesome one. I appreciate both of you coming on. I figured it would be good to get both of you together.
I was excited when you said Kurt was going to be on. I knew we'd have a good discussion.
I didn't even know you knew who I was.
Huh?
I didn't even know you knew who I was. I'm flattered.
Yeah, of course. I knew this would be a good one. I really look forward to this one. It's been a really fun way to spend the afternoon with you guys.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.